Beneath the quiet breath of the midnight wind, there stretches a ribbon of stone, winding endlessly across the back of the earth. It coils over mountains and valleys, drapes itself across dry deserts, and vanishes into far-off mist. It is a wall so vast that, even as your eyes wander along its curves, you cannot find its ending. Under the softness of the moonlight, it does not look like something human hands could have made. It looks like something ancient, something alive, like the spine of a dragon sleeping upon the earth. The Great Wall of China, though we give it this name now, in the calm of hindsight, was never built in a single breath. It was not raised by one man or one empire, but instead by countless hands, countless dreams, and countless fears. But tonight, let us not think of wars and kings just yet. Let us begin gently, with a scene. A quiet night in China's northern mountains, perhaps more than 2,000 years ago, when the first ideas of a wall began to stir like whispers carried by the wind. Imagine, if you will, a land bathed in moonlight. The ridges of the mountains appear like waves, frozen in stone, their peaks softened by a veil of drifting mist. In the valleys, rivers move quietly, their surfaces catching glimmers of starlight, as though each ripple holds a secret. From a distance, you may hear the faint toll of a bronze bell in a village temple, marking the midnight hour. Somewhere nearby, farmers sleep inside homes of clay and wood, curled beside their hearth fires, while their oxen dream in stables made of straw. All is peaceful for the moment, but along the horizon, beyond those mountains, lies a different world, a world of horsemen, of swift riders who move like shadows across the steppes. For centuries, China's northern borders had been visited by tribes who did not live in walled cities or farmed valleys, but who lived instead by the bow, the hunt, and the freedom of endless grasslands. They were fierce, and they were fast. When they raided, they came like a storm, sudden, unstoppable, and then gone again, leaving behind the echoes of hoofbeats and the ashes of fire. It was in this tension, between quiet villages and restless riders, that the dream of a wall began. Now, let us draw closer to this dream. Picture a solitary figure walking along a ridge. He is a farmer by day, a watchman by night, tasked by his village to look for fires or approaching riders. His lantern is small, its light flickering against the stone, and the cold wind lifts the edges of his cloak. He pauses often, not only to scan the valleys below, but also to gaze upward. For above him, the stars gleam in their ancient patterns. The North Star burns steadily, a guide for both peasants and kings. And the farmer wonders, as countless men must have wondered, how fragile their homes are, how easily a small village can vanish beneath the hooves of strangers. He thinks of his children sleeping back in the hut, and he whispers into the night a wish for something greater, something that could protect them, something that could stand as a boundary between safety and fear. That wish, small as it seems, was the seed of the Great Wall. When the first rulers of China thought of unity, their visions were vast. They wanted to bind rivers, valleys, and kingdoms into one. They wished to stretch authority not only across their villages, but also across the imagination of their people. For them, the idea of a wall was not only about defense, it was about permanence. A wall meant stability. A wall meant power that could be seen, touched, and believed in. But before emperors, before armies, there were only simple beginnings. The first walls were not stone, nor brick, nor towers. They were mounds of tamped earth, raised by farmers with tools of wood and bronze. These were not yet the walls we imagine today, crawling endlessly over mountains. They were shorter, humbler, but still they carried a dream of holding the horizon, of saying to the restless riders, "Here, and no further." Imagine standing in such a place, a crude wall of earth rising against a backdrop of stars. The torches of guards burn faintly in the wind. Beyond the wall, the night is silent, the grassland stretching on forever. Within, families sleep more peacefully, believing that this barrier, however fragile, will keep danger at bay. And so the story begins not with grandeur, but with fear, hope, and the will to survive. Yet, the Great Wall is more than a shield. From the very first, it became a kind of thread, weaving together villages, kingdoms, dynasties, and even centuries. As we walk along it in our imagination, we do not only walk across stone, we walk across time itself. Consider the sound of footsteps upon its surface. Each step echoes not only through stone, but through memory. Soldiers who marched along it carried with them the weight of duty. Travelers who passed by whispered prayers for safe journeys. Even the wind, brushing against its battlements, carries stories of love, of loss, of endurance. The wall, in its endlessness, is like time itself, unbroken, though marked with scars. But let us not rush too quickly into history's battles. Tonight, as this story unfolds, the Great Wall will reveal itself slowly, gently, as if inviting us to dream alongside it. Let us pause here, in this first block, and watch the wall in moonlight. Its stones glow faintly silver, its shadow stretches long across the sleeping land. The mist curls against its sides like a veil, softening its harshness, making it look less like a weapon and more like a dream. High above, constellations turn, the same constellations that farmers, emperors, and wanderers once gazed upon. They must have wondered, as we wonder now, how can such a wall last through storms, through winters, through centuries? And yet it does. Perhaps that is why the Great Wall remains one of humanity's most powerful creations. Not because it is tall, not because it is long, but because it embodies a dream that stretched beyond lifetimes, the dream of safety, of unity, of protection against the unknown. And so, as you close your eyes and drift into this story, imagine yourself walking along its path. The lanterns flicker, the stars shimmer, and the stones beneath your feet hold the weight of thousands of years. You are not alone. With each step, you walk beside the countless souls who once built, guarded, and dreamed of this wall. This, then, is our beginning. A beginning not of kings, but of mountains and stars, of dreams and fears. A beginning where silence reigns, and yet, if you listen closely, you can hear it, the heartbeat of a civilization. Protected by stone, the wall stretches onward, the story stretches with it, and together, we shall follow where it leads. Close your eyes and picture the northern edge of ancient China, not the land of bustling cities and fertile valleys, but the wide frontier where farmlands end and the grasslands begin. Here, the soil is less gentle, the winds sharper, and the nights longer. And here, across this line where earth seems to tremble beneath the weight of distance, danger always seemed to stir. It is a timeless truth that civilizations, no matter how beautiful, often grow beside shadows. For China, in its earliest dynasties, those shadows were the horsemen of the steppe. The steppe riders imagined the vast grasslands stretching endlessly to the north, plains so wide that, from horizon to horizon, not a single tree might break the emptiness. The sky above is immense, painted in hues of deep blue by day and star-strewn black by night. Upon this canvas move the nomads, their horses swift, their lives woven with the rhythm of migration. They are not bound by villages or walls. Their homes are felt tents that rise and fall with the seasons. Their food is the milk of their animals, the hunt of wild herds. Their strength lies not in heavy fortresses, but in speed, in skill, in the mastery of bow and arrow. From a distance, their raids came like storms, a sudden line of riders against the horizon, their hooves drumming like thunder, their arrows darkening the skies. And when they vanished, they left behind smoldering ruins, echoes of cries, and a reminder: the northern frontier was never truly safe. For farmers who tilled the soil, whose world was rooted in stillness, these riders seemed like spirits of chaos, four rulers in their palaces. They were constant puzzles. How do you defend a civilization against a people who cannot be pinned down? The fragile borders of early dynasties before the Great Wall. Before unity under a single emperor, there were smaller kingdoms scattered across what would one day become China. Each had its boundaries, marked not by stone, but by rivers, forests, or wooden stockades. Each had its own militia, farmers who carried hoes by day and spears by night. But wooden fences could be burned, small armies could be scattered, and though kingdoms might try to guard their fields, the riders of the steppe were like the wind. You could not hold them, you could only endure their passing. The northern kingdoms lived with this tension constantly. Their temples prayed for protection, their storytellers spun tales of guardian spirits, and their people whispered of walls that might, one day, rise like mountains to keep the riders away. The night fires picture a lonely village on the frontier. It is winter, and the air is sharp, cutting at the skin like blades of glass. Snow drifts against the edges of houses, muffling sound, making the world feel still and fragile. But then, out on the steppe, a glow rises, first faint, then brighter, like an ember growing into flame. Soon, the glow multiplies torches, dozens of them, carried by horsemen. A bell tolls in the village. Men grab spears, women gather children into cellars. Old priests chant hurried prayers. The riders come with fire, their horses snorting clouds of breath, their arrows raining down. By dawn, the village may be gone. These night raids, repeated again and again, became part of the northern people's memory. They shaped their fears, their hopes, and, eventually, their resolve to build something that would stand against the endless tide. The vision of King's Inn, the courts of rulers. The raids were more than local tragedies. They were questions of survival. How could a kingdom grow strong when its edges were always bleeding? How could farmers be taxed if their fields burned? How could cities flourish if caravans were always plundered on the roads? It was here, among ministers and generals, that the idea of walls began to take root. Not one wall, at first, but many. Each kingdom might raise its own defenses, building mounds of earth, wooden barriers, or stone towers, but even so, they were fragile. Yet the seed was planted. The thought lingered, if only the land itself could be reshaped. If only there could be a single barrier across the northern frontier. Fires along the frontier let us return, for a moment, to those nights on the edge of China. Villages often lit watchfires on tall hills, beacons that could be seen for miles. When riders were spotted, one fire became 2, then 10, each beacon igniting the next. In this way, warnings sped across valleys faster than riders themselves. But warnings were not enough. Fires told of danger, but they did not stop it. And so, slowly, people began to dream not only of signals, but of barriers, walls of earth, walls of stone, something that could transform a fragile boundary into a lasting line. The whisper of myths in the hearts of common people. The raids were remembered through stories. Some spoke of ghostly guardians who rose at night to defend the land. Others whispered of dragons, whose coiled backs might one day harden into walls. Parents told children that one day, heaven itself would grant them protection, a gift of stone that no arrow could pierce. And though these were only tales, they gave comfort. They planted imagination into the soil of fear. And from imagination, reality eventually grows. A civilization's choice as you drift deeper into this story. Imagine yourself as a farmer living 2,000 years ago. You rise with the dawn, work your fields, pray to your ancestors, and watch the horizon each evening with quiet dread. Your tools are simple, your life humble, yet in your heart, you carry a wish that your children may grow in safety, without the shadow of raids. This wish was not yours alone. It was shared by millions. And when such a wish becomes universal, it shapes the destiny of civilizations. For the kingdoms of China, the raids of the steppe tribes became the shadow that pushed them to dream larger than they ever had before, larger than their villages, larger than their borders. They dreamed of walls that could stretch across mountains. They dreamed of a boundary not just of wood, but of eternity, the foreshadowing of stone tonight. As we close this block, imagine standing once more on the frontier. The sky above is filled with stars, the same stars that the riders watch as they ride, the same stars that farmers pray to in their fields. The land is vast, unending, mysterious, but in the stillness of night, if you listen closely, you might hear it. Not the thunder of hooves, not the crackle of fire, but something softer, a whisper carried by the wind, the whisper of a dream that has not yet taken shape. The dream of a wall, stretching across mountains, built not only to guard the land, but to give peace to generations yet unborn. That whisper will become reality, but for now, it is only a thought, a prayer, a dream floating like mist between the stars. When we think of the Great Wall of China, it is easy to imagine the long, winding stone fortifications that stretch across mountains, deserts, and valleys. Yet, the wall that survives today, those iconic stone towers and battlements, represents only a fraction of its story. Before the stone walls rose, there were humbler, simpler defenses built of earth, wood, and reeds, each reflecting the era's resources, needs, and technology. This block will take us deep into those beginnings, where mud walls guarded ancient fields, and the earliest concept of a great wall was born. The idea of a wall before the wall centuries, before Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, the scattered kingdoms of the north had already begun experimenting with barriers. These were not yet the monumental constructions we know, but rather rudimentary earthworks. Kings, dukes, and local warlords built trenches, wooden palisades, and stamped earth ramparts to protect farmland and water sources from raiders. The Great Wall, in its essence, was not one wall, but a collection of smaller walls, each answering the same question: how do we keep danger out? To understand this, Picture the northern plains of China 2,000 years ago. Herds of nomadic horsemen roamed freely, skilled archers who struck suddenly, burning fields and taking livestock before vanishing back into the steppe. For sedentary farmers, this threat was constant. To them, a wall was not merely stone or mud, it was survival. Mud and red walls of the early dynasties. The Western Zhou dynasty, 1046-771 BC. Some of the first recorded defensive walls were raised. These were not walls in the sense of today's monumental towers, but raised banks of earth, reinforced with reeds and timber. Builders would dig trenches, piling up the soil to form ramparts. The soil was pounded down, layer by layer, using wooden frames and stone hammers until it hardened into what is known as rammed earth. This method of Hamtu rammed earth was simple but surprisingly strong. The walls could stand several meters high and thick enough to slow an enemy charge. Even centuries later, portions of these early mud walls still stand, battered by time but testifying to their durability. Such walls were not continuous barriers stretching for miles, but localized defenses, encircling towns or protecting borders of feudal states. Imagine walking in such a landscape. Scattered farming villages, each with its own protective rampart, torches burning at night atop watch mounds, farmers sleeping with the faint comfort of a wall standing between them and the unknown horsemen beyond. The rise of the warring states and the first long walls by the warring states. Period 475 to 221 BC. China was divided into powerful rival kingdoms, Zhao, Qi, Yan, Wei, Han, Qin, and Chu. Each was locked in a desperate struggle for dominance, not only against each other, but also against nomadic tribes pressing from the north. It was during this period that the concept of building long walls truly began. The state of Zhou, for example, constructed massive defensive lines across its northern frontier, aimed at keeping out the Xiongnu fierce nomadic horsemen. Unlike earlier mud ramparts, these walls extended for hundreds of kilometers, forming a continuous line of defense. Other states, like Qi and Yan, followed suit, building their own long walls. The very idea of these walls was revolutionary. They were not simply city defenses, but landscape defenses, attempts to draw a line across the land itself, separating civilization from wilderness. This was, in essence, the birth of the Great Wall's philosophy, to create a boundary between us and them, farmers and raiders, settled society and the roaming steppe. Building techniques, the science of rammed earth, the warring states. Engineers perfected the method of rammed earth. They used wooden frames called hang, into which layers of soil were poured. Workers would then pound the soil with heavy wooden rammers until it compressed into a solid block. Layer upon layer, the walls grew taller and sturdier. Different soils were mixed, gravel, sand, and clay, to achieve stronger cohesion. In some areas, reeds or brushwood were layered between soil to reduce erosion from wind and rain. In arid desert regions, sand was mixed with water and compacted until it hardened like stone. It was labor-intensive, requiring thousands of workers, but the results were formidable. Some of these early earth walls were up to 7 meters high and 5 meters wide at the base, formidable enough to halt a cavalry charge. They often featured watchtowers, raised earthen platforms where soldiers could light beacons or launch arrows. Though built of humble dirt, they were an extraordinary display of coordination, manpower, and strategic thinking. Life along the early walls for the soldiers stationed along these early defenses, life was harsh. They were often farmers conscripted to serve, forced to patrol barren stretches of frontier land where winters were bitter and summers scorching. Supplies were difficult to transport, and many soldiers lived in crude barracks, sleeping on straw mats within earthen forts. Still, these walls gave them a sense of purpose. Lighting a beacon fire from a watchtower was not just a signal of danger, but also a reminder that they were the guardians of civilization's edge. For the farmers behind the walls, the sight of a distant beacon glowing on a hilltop must have been both terrifying and reassuring, a sign of danger, but also a sign that someone was watching, someone was protecting them. The symbolic power of the wall. Even in these early days, walls carried symbolic weight. They were more than barriers, they were statements of power. A wall proclaimed, "This land is defended, this land belongs to us." It was a visible marker of sovereignty. To the enemy horsemen, the walls declared resistance. To the people inside, they promised security. As time passed, these walls began shaping the very psychology of the people. The idea of being inside or outside the wall influenced culture, identity, and politics. The wall was both shield and mirror, protecting and defining those who lived within. The connection between walls and civilization there is a deep irony in the story of the Great Wall. The very same nomads it was built to keep out also contributed to the vitality of Chinese civilization through trade and cultural exchange. Yet, in the ancient imagination, walls became the necessary defense against chaos. They were civilization's frontier, the thin line separating cultivated fields from untamed steppe. As early walls stretched across plains and deserts, they began to knit together into something greater, though not yet the unified Great Wall. These segments foreshadowed the grand project that Qin Shi Huang would one day undertake. Legacy of the early walls today. Fragments of those ancient earthen walls still remain, weathered by time but visible in the northern deserts and plains. Archaeologists studying them marvel at how such simple materials could survive to millennia. These remnants remind us that the Great Wall was not born in a single moment but evolved gradually, beginning with mud, reed, and determination. The early walls represent the first chapter in a story of endurance. How a civilization facing endless threats sought to shield itself, not with swords alone, but with earth piled high into a symbol of permanence. The story of the Great Wall of China takes a dramatic turn with the rise of one of history's most fascinating and controversial figures, Qin Shi Huang, 259–210 BC, the first emperor of a unified China. His ambition reshaped not only the political map but also the very landscape itself. Among his grand projects, standardizing weights and measures, creating a national road system, and constructing his legendary mausoleum guarded by the Terracotta Army, was his determination to merge the scattered northern walls into a single, unified barrier. It was this vision that transformed scattered earthworks into something that could be called the First Great Wall. The unification of China. Before Qin Shi Huang's rise, China was fractured into 7 powerful states during the Warring States period. For 752–21 BC, these states fought endlessly, exhausting resources and lives in pursuit of dominance. The state of Qin, located in the west, was once considered a backwater, but under the leadership of ruthless kings, talented generals, and reforms by ministers such as Xiangyang, it grew into a disciplined, militarized powerhouse. By 221 BCE, the young King Yingzheng of Qin had conquered all rival states, declaring himself the first emperor. Qin Shi Huangdi. For the first time, China was unified under a single ruler. With this unification came not only new opportunities but also new threats. The emperor now had vast borders to protect, stretching from the south's rice fields to the harsh deserts of the north. It was from this position of absolute authority that Qin Shi Huang looked toward the northern frontier, where the nomadic Zhongnu tribes posed a formidable threat. Skilled horsemen and archers, they raided Chinese farmlands, testing the defenses of the new empire. Qin Shi Huang's solution was monumental. Take the scattered walls of the old kingdoms and link them together into one massive barrier, extending for thousands of kilometers. The vision of a wall across an empire made Qin Shi Huang unique was not simply his power but his vision. Earlier kings had built walls, but their efforts were localized, designed to protect their own state. Qin Shi Huang thought bigger. He envisioned a continuous defensive system, stretching across mountains and deserts, uniting the old walls of Yanshao and Qin into one formidable line. This wall would not merely protect, would symbolize the emperor's strength and the permanence of the empire. By creating a physical boundary across the land, Qin Shi Huang declared both to his people and to his enemies, China is one, and it is strong. Mobilizing the empire, forced labor, and human cost constructing such a wall, however, came at a terrible price. Historical sources, particularly Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, describe the staggering human effort involved. Hundreds of thousands of laborers were conscripted, including soldiers, peasants, prisoners, and even scholars who opposed the emperor's rule. These workers toiled in some of the harshest environments on Earth's scorching deserts, treacherous mountain passes, and icy northern plains. With primitive tools, they carried earth, stone, and timber, pounding them into rammed earth walls or stacking them into defensive structures. The toll was immense. Many workers died from exhaustion, starvation, exposure, or disease. Legends say their bones were buried within the wall itself. though archaeological evidence suggests they were more often left in mass graves nearby. Regardless, the suffering of these laborers became part of the Great Wall's myth, remembered in poems and folktales as the longest cemetery on Earth. Building the first true Great Wall, the Qin Wall, as it is sometimes called, stretched across China's northern frontier, linking the existing fortifications of the former states. Estimates suggest it extended for more than 5,000 kilometers, though much of it was rammed earth rather than stone. The wall followed the natural terrain, snaking along mountain ridges, cutting across valleys, and even spanning arid deserts. Towers were built at intervals to serve as lookout posts and communication points, using smoke signals by day and fire beacons by night. Messages could be relayed rapidly along the wall, allowing distant garrisons to respond quickly to invasions. Unlike city walls, which were built for defense in place, this was a wall of deterrence, designed to slow raiders and give defenders time to mobilize. It was a barrier against mobility, forcing swift cavalry to confront the slower but numerous armies of Qin on less favorable terms. The wall, as political symbol beyond its military purpose, the wall served a psychological and political role. For Qin Shi Huang, it was an expression of imperial power. Just as he had standardized laws, currencies, and writing systems, so too did he impose a physical standard across the land. The wall unified not just bricks and stones but the very identity of China as a bounded, protected civilization. In propaganda, the wall proclaimed that the emperor had secured the realm from chaos. To the people inside, it reinforced the idea that they belonged to an empire so mighty it could reshape mountains and deserts. To outsiders, it was a warning. This land was not unguarded, and crossing it meant facing the might of Qin. The human stories, legends of suffering and loyalty. Many legends grew around this period of construction, blending history with myth. One of the most famous is the story of Meng Zhengnu, a woman whose husband was conscripted to work on the wall. When he died from exhaustion, she wept so bitterly at the wall that a section of it collapsed, revealing his body. Though folkloric, the tale reflects the widespread suffering endured by those who built the wall and became a symbol of grief and resistance against tyranny. Another story tells of soldiers stationed along the wall who carved poems into stones, expressing longing for their families far away. These personal laments remind us that behind the emperor's vision were countless individual lives, caught between duty and despair. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with Kantula Wall was not Qin Shi Huang's only vast project. He also built a massive network of roads, canals, and the famous mausoleum guarded by the Terracotta Army. These undertakings reveal his obsession with order, permanence, and control. In his mind, the empire was not simply to be ruled, it was to be reshaped, sculpted into a vision of eternity. The wall, therefore, was not just military engineering, it was philosophy in action. The belief that human effort, guided by absolute authority, could bend the world to its will. Yet, the very harshness of this vision, its disregard for individual suffering, would ultimately sow seeds of discontent. The fall of Qin and the fate of the wall. Despite Qin Shi Huang's power, his dynasty was short. His harsh laws, heavy taxation, and forced labor bred widespread resentment. After his death in 210 BCE, uprisings erupted across the empire. Within a few years, the Qin dynasty collapsed, replaced by the Han. The wall itself did not vanish, but without the centralized might of Qin, large portions fell into disrepair. Yet the idea of the wall, its utility, and its symbolism remained alive. Future dynasties would rebuild, extend, and reinforce it, each adding their own chapter to the story. The Qin legacy. Though the Qin dynasty lasted barely 15 years, its achievements echoed across history. Qin Shi Huang's unification of China laid the foundations of a state that would endure, in various forms, for more than 2 millennia, and the wall he built, though primitive compared to later stone fortifications, marked the first time the dream of a continuous northern defense had been realized. Even in ruin, the Qin Wall was remembered. Later dynasties looked to it as precedent, a reminder that an empire as vast as China required boundaries not just in law but in stone and earth. Reflection. The first Great Wall is an act of faith seen from a distance of 2,000 years. The first Great Wall was as much an act of faith as of engineering. Faith in the power of centralized rule, in the ability of human labor to command nature, and in the permanence of empire. Though dynasties would rise and fall, and though the wall itself would crumble, the idea it embodied that civilization could defend itself by raising a boundary against chaos would endure. In this sense, Qin Shi Huang's wall was not the end of the story, but its true beginning, setting the stage for centuries of rebuilding, expansion, and legend. When the Qin dynasty collapsed after only 15 turbulent years, many believed its harshness had doomed it from the start. Yet from the ashes of Qin's authoritarian rule, a new dynasty rose, one that would endure for 4 centuries and define much of what the world still associates with China today. The Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE. The Han emperors inherited a vast and fragile empire. They had to balance the lessons of Qin's centralized authority with a gentler, more Confucian-inspired governance. But one challenge remained the same as before: the northern frontier. The nomadic horsemen of the Jiangnu Confederation still threatened the stability of the empire. To meet this challenge, the Han revived, repaired, and expanded the wall system that Qin Shi Huang had begun. Yet they went further. Under the Han, the wall became not only a military barrier but also a corridor of exchange, deeply tied to the opening of the Silk Road, which connected China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually the Roman world. A fragile inheritance when the Han founder Liu Beng, later Emperor Gaozu, seized power in 202 BCE. He inherited a restless empire. The Qin's collapse had left gaping wounds, famine, and distrust among the people. At first, Liu Bang was reluctant to continue the Qin's massive building projects, which were seen as symbols of cruelty and oppression. But the threat of the Xiongnu quickly forced his hand. These nomads, based in the northern steppe, were fierce warriors, their power rooted in speed and mobility. Their horses allowed them to travel vast distances, strike settlements suddenly, and vanish before Chinese armies could respond. The frontier, always porous, was now vulnerable. Farmers were afraid to till the northern soil. Cities worried about raids, and the dream of a safe, stable empire was at risk. Thus, though Gaozu sought to soften Qin's reputation for tyranny, he soon recognized the need for frontier defenses, and walls once again became central to China's survival. Point 2. The Han approach: diplomacy and defense. Unlike Qin Shi Huang, who relied heavily on brute force and mass labor, the early Han emperors experimented with a more mixed strategy. They combined diplomacy with fortification. One of the most notable policies was the Hekin, or peace, marriage system. Han princesses, or noble women presented as such, were married off to Xiongnu chieftains in hopes of buying peace. Along with brides came lavish dowries of silk, grain, and wine. For a time, this bought temporary stability, but the Xiongnu often continued raiding despite such treaties. At the same time, Han rulers ordered the repair and extension of the wall. They realized that diplomacy could not be relied upon alone. The empire needed hard borders. Under Emperor Wu of Han R. 141 to 87 BCE, the wall expanded massively, stretching further west into the deserts of Gansu and Xinjiang. This was no longer just a defensive line, it was a lifeline, securing trade routes, military supply chains, and settlements along the Silk Road. 3. Engineering. The Han Wall. The Han Wall was different from Qin's. Instead of purely rammed earth, the Han builders experimented with layers of reeds, gravel, and sand, especially in desert areas. This technique gave the walls more resilience against wind erosion. Watchtowers and beacon towers became even more sophisticated. They were spaced at intervals of a few kilometers, allowing signals of smoke by day and fire by night to travel across great distances. These towers acted like an ancient telegraph, enabling the empire to respond swiftly to attacks. Inside the wall system, fortresses and garrisons were built, housing thousands of soldiers and their families. Whole towns grew up along the frontier, supported by state farms that produced food for the troops. What began as a wall of defense was transforming into a zone of colonization and settlement for soldiers of the wall. Life for a Han soldier on the frontier was grueling. Stationed far from the fertile heartlands of the empire, they endured extremes of heat and cold, sandstorms in the deserts, and isolation from their families. Many were conscripts, drafted for years of service. Others were convicts, whose punishment was to guard the empire's edge. Still others were professional soldiers, drawn to the frontier by promises of land and reward. Daily routines included patrolling the walls, tending fires for signaling, repairing fortifications, and watching for the dust clouds that signaled approaching horsemen. Nights were long, filled with the howl of wolves across the steppe. Yet there was also camaraderie. Soldiers carved graffiti into the walls, writing poems about their longing for home or their pride in serving the Han. In some desert regions, archaeologists have found bamboo slips left by soldiers, recording everything from supply inventories to love letters. These voices across millennia remind us that behind the grandeur of the Han Wall were human beings, struggling, dreaming, and enduring. 5. Emperor Wu and the Great Xfinity. Was under Emperor Wu of Han that the Great Wall truly became a colossal project. Known as one of China's most ambitious rulers, Wu was determined not merely to defend, but to dominate. He launched massive military campaigns against the Xiongnu, pushing them north and west. To support these campaigns, the wall was extended deep into the Gobi Desert, forming a chain of fortresses and beacon towers that protected supply routes. This expansion was costly both in treasure and in lives, yet it had a transformative effect. For the first time, China's influence stretched far into Central Asia. The wall no longer marked the end of the Chinese world, but rather its gateway to distant lands. 6. The Wall and the Silk Road. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Han Wall was its role in fostering the Silk Road. With fortresses guarding the corridors of Gansu and the Hexi Corridor, merchants could travel with greater security. Silk, lacquerware, and porcelain traveled westward, while horses, jade, glass, and spices came east. Ideas flowed as well. Buddhism, born in India, entered China along these routes, carried by monks and traders. The wall, originally built to keep the world out, now became part of a system that connected China to the world. Imagine a caravan moving slowly through the desert, camels laden with bales of silk, guarded by armed escorts. In the distance, a Han fortress rises, its walls a safe haven against bandits and raiders. The wall, once a symbol of isolation, had become a conduit of exchange, bridging civilizations. 7. Stories of contact and conflict. The wall was more than stone and earth. It was a meeting place of cultures. Han soldiers and officials interacted with nomads, traders, and emissaries. Some married local women, creating communities that blended steppe and agricultural traditions. But there was also conflict. Raids and counter-raids were constant. The Xiongnu, though weakened by Han campaigns, never disappeared. Legends tell of desperate battles where whole garrisons perished, their beacons sending final signals before being overwhelmed. These stories of bravery and loss became part of the folklore of the frontier, shaping how later generations remembered the wall, not just as a structure, but as a stage for sacrifice. 8. The human cost and legacy. The Han Wall demanded immense resources. Taxes were levied to supply the frontier, and labor drafts pulled farmers from their fields. Critics argued that the burden of maintaining distant fortresses strained the economy and weakened the empire's heartland. And yet, the wall endured. Even as sections crumbled, the memory of it remained. To later dynasties, it was proof that defending China required monumental effort, and that the empire's greatness was tied to its ability to command both land and people. 9. Reflection. The wall is dual symbol. Under the Han, the wall became more than a defense. It was at once a barrier and a bridge, a line that defined China's northern edge, but also a lifeline that linked China to worlds beyond. It symbolized strength against the nomads, but also openness to trade. It was both a wound of human suffering and a beacon of human ambition. Through the Han's efforts, the wall entered not just the geography of China but also its mythology, the belief that the empire could endure by standing strong, adapting, and reaching outward. Closing of Block 5. Thus, by the end of the Han dynasty, the wall had transformed from Qinshi, Huang's symbol of unification, into a vast network of fortifications and settlements tied to the great artery of the Silk Road. It was no longer just about keeping enemies out. It was about managing contact, trade, and identity at the edges of civilization. That when we speak of the Great Wall today, much of its enduring idea of it as both protector and passageway comes from this Han legacy. The Han dynasty had stretched like a golden thread across 4 centuries. Its emperors had built, expanded, and sustained a vision of unity that radiated from fertile river valleys to the harsh deserts of the north. But all golden ages must dim. By the 2nd century CE, the Han was a weary giant, its strength sapped by internal corruption, peasant uprisings, and the endless strain of defending its vast frontiers. And so the wall, once a living artery of defense and trade, began to slip into shadow. This block explores how the wall, which under the Han had been a lifeline of empire, fell into disrepair and neglect as China itself fractured, setting the stage for centuries of turbulence before its rebirth under later dynasties. 1. The cracks in the empire, the seeds of Han decline, were sown long before the dynasty fell. Over time, powerful families and eunuchs at court grew rich and arrogant, draining resources from the central government. Farmers, overburdened by taxes and forced labor, abandoned their fields. Peasant unrest swelled, culminating in the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE. Tens of thousands of desperate farmers, their heads wrapped in yellow cloth, rose up demanding justice. Though the revolt was crushed, it shook the dynasty to its foundations. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining the frontier, including the garrisons and fortresses of the wall, became unsustainable. Supplies dwindled, and soldiers on the wall were left underfed, poorly clothed, and forgotten by the empire they were sworn to defend. 2. A wall without watchers. Imagine standing on a watchtower along the Han Wall during this time. The beacon firewood, once kept dry and ready to ignite, lies damp and unused. The walls, once patrolled by vigilant soldiers, echo with emptiness. Garrisons thinned as troops deserted or were recalled to fight civil wars elsewhere. Caravans along the Silk Road grew more vulnerable to raids. The wall, once humming with life, became a relic, a silent sentinel abandoned to the winds. Archaeological records even suggest entire forts were left without garrisons, their supplies looted by wandering bands. The wall was not torn down, but worse, it was ignored, allowed to crumble into the landscape. 3. The age of the warlords after the last Han emperor was reduced to a puppet. Real power fractured among competing warlords. This was the beginning of the Three Kingdoms era. 2202806, one of the most romanticized yet bloods periods of Chinese history. The empire was no longer united enough to maintain its grand defenses. Each warlord cared only for his own territory, redirecting resources to armies that fought rival factions rather than external invaders. The wall, so long a project of centralized authority, could not survive in an age of division. Its stones and packed earth eroded. Farmers grazed their animals along its edges. Bandits roamed freely, sometimes even using abandoned fortresses as their hideouts. 4. Legends of abandonment. As the wall decayed, stories grew. One tale tells of ghostly soldiers who still marched along the battlements at night, keeping watch for an emperor who would never return. Another speaks of beacon towers that lit themselves on stormy evenings, signaling dangers that no longer threatened. Whether fact or folklore, these legends reveal how deeply the wall had become tied to the Chinese imagination. Even in neglect, it remained a symbol, proof of what the empire had once been, and perhaps a reminder of what it could be again. 5. Life in the shadow of ruin. For the ordinary people living near the wall, life went on. Farmers planted crops in the shadow of abandoned watchtowers. Traders still attempted the Silk Road, though with greater peril. Nomads from the steppe found the wall less a barrier than an open invitation. They crossed freely, mingling with frontier settlers, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. In this way, the frontier blurred. The wall, meant to separate China from the world beyond, now became a meeting ground where cultures intermingled. Han Chinese intermarried with nomads, and new hybrid communities formed in the borderlands. The wall no longer protected a single civilization, it had become part of many. 6. A pause in the dream of centuries that followed saw repeated cycles of fragmentation and attempted reunification. The Jin dynasty briefly reunited China in the 3rd century, but soon collapsed under pressure from nomadic invasions. The northern and southern dynasties period for 22589 CE brought further chaos. During these eras, the wall was largely neglected. Local rulers sometimes repaired small sections, but there was no grand, empire-wide project. The dream of a continuous barrier faded, replaced by local defenses and ad hoc fortifications. The wall, in this age, became a memory, a monument of the past rather than a living guardian. 7. The wall in poetry and memory. Even as its stones crumbled, the wall lingered in culture. Poets wrote verses comparing the decline of the wall to the decline of the dynasty. For scholars of later generations, it became a cautionary tale. The empire that could not maintain its borders could not maintain itself. The wall's presence in memory was itself a kind of survival. It endured not through military use but through imagination woven into the fabric of history, myth, and philosophy. 8. The ghost of empires. Nomads swept into northern China during the 4th and 5th centuries. Some rebuilt portions of the wall for themselves. For example, the Northern Wei dynasty 386 to 534 CE, founded by a nomadic people who adopted Chinese ways, restored certain fortifications. Ironically, those who had once been kept out by the wall now used it to defend their own rule within China. This reversal shows the wall's adaptability. It was not bound to one dynasty or people. It could serve whoever held power, but it also shows its vulnerability. Without a strong empire behind it, the wall was nothing but earth and stone. 9. Reflection. The wall forgotten by the 6th century. Much of the Han Wall was little more than ruins scattered across the northern plains and deserts. Yet, even in neglect, it whispered of China's capacity for greatness. Travelers who passed its remains saw not just collapsed ramparts, but also a vision of unity that once wasn't could be again. The wall, in this age of forgetting, became like a sleeping dragon, dormant, buried in dust, but waiting for the day when emperors with vision would awaken it again. Closing of Block 6. So the Han Wall, once a proud frontier of defense and trade, slipped into obscurity during the centuries of division. But it never vanished entirely. Its stones remained, its memory endured, and in time, new dynasties would revive it, each reshaping the wall to their own needs. In the silence of those abandoned watchtowers, we sense the rhythm of history, the ebb and flow of empire, the rise and fall of human ambition. The wall reminds us that nothing, however grand, is permanent. And yet, even in ruin, it carries forward the memory of what once was, and the promise of what may come again. The centuries after the fall of the Han were an age of division, when China's great unity seemed little more than a distant dream. Yet history moves in cycles, and no shadow lasts forever. By the late 6th century, a new power rose, the Sui dynasty 581 to 618 CE, ambitious, ruthless, but determined to bind the empire together once more. Though short-lived, the Sui sparked a rebirth of the Great Wall, briefly breathing life into its long-forgotten stones. And their successors, the Temps, would lift China into a golden age, where the wall found itself in a new role, less as a barrier of fear, and more as a symbol of cultural pride. 1. The Sui dream of unity. The Sui dynasty was founded by Emperor Wen of Sui, a man of vision and iron will, rising from the turmoil of the northern and southern dynasties. Wen sought to reforge China's unity through a mixture of clever governance and brute force. He knew that unity was more than politics. It needed symbols, structures, and enduring works that reminded the people of their shared destiny. One such work was the Great Wall. The northern frontier still loomed as a danger. Nomadic tribes, now including the fierce Turkic peoples, dominated the steppe. To confront them, Wen ordered repairs and extensions of the wall, reviving its ghostly presence along the frontiers. Tens of thousands of conscripts labored once more with tamped earth and stone, reconstructing watchtowers that had collapsed into dust. For the first time in centuries, the wall stirred, like an old warrior summoned back to duty. 2. The price of power. But the Sui ambition carried a terrible cost. To rebuild the wall, dredge the Grand Canal, and construct palaces and temples, the dynasty imposed crushing taxes and forced millions into labor. Soldiers, farmers, artisans, all were compelled to give their sweat and lives to the emperor's vision. Reports tell of entire villages emptied as men were conscripted to the frontier. Many never returned. The wall, though reborn, was built with suffering. In this way, the Sui mirrored the Qin of centuries earlier, magnificent in vision, but merciless in execution. And just as the Qin had fallen swiftly, so too would the Sui. After only 2 emperors, the dynasty collapsed in 618, undone by rebellion, exhaustion, and the impossibility of sustaining its brutal pace. 3. The Tang inheritance. From the ruins of the Sui rose the Tang dynasty 618 to 907 CE, one of the most glorious eras in Chinese history. Unlike the Sui, the Tangs found a way to balance ambition with endurance. Their empire stretched from Korea to Central Asia, and their capital Chang'an became one of the largest, wealthiest, and most cosmopolitan cities on earth. For the Tangs, the wall was no longer just a military barrier, was also a stage for diplomacy, culture, and identity. The Temp's armies often pushed deep into the steppe, securing buffer zones beyond the wall, where the Sui had rebuilt to defend. The Temps rebuilt to project power. The wall thus became less of a last defense and more of a gateway threshold through which traders and monks passed into the heart of the empire. 4. The Wall and the Silk Road. The Temps era coincided with the height of the Silk Road, and the wall's fortresses once again became bustling hubs of activity. Caravans from Persia, India, Arabia, and even distant Byzantium crossed into China through passes guarded by the wall. Imagine the scene. A Persian merchant leading camels laden with lapis lazuli and fine glassware, a Buddhist monk from India, robes dusty from the desert, seeking new scriptures, Arab traders bringing horses, dates, and stories of lands beyond the oceans, Chinese officials inspecting goods beneath the shadow of ancient battlements. The wall, once a symbol of separation, had transformed into a bridge between worlds. 5. Poetry of the Wall. The Thames Age was also a golden age of poetry, and the wall inspired some of the greatest poets of all time. Wang Wei, Li Bai, and Du Fu wrote verses that evoked both the grandeur and the sorrow of the frontier. One famous theme was the plight of soldiers stationed along the wall lonely, far from home, facing the harsh winds of the steppe. Poems told of endless watch under the stars, of longing for family, and of the haunting sound of camel bells drifting from the Silk Road. Yet in those same poems, the wall was also a place of wonder, where heaven touched earth and where the empire's reach extended beyond. Imagination. 6. Diplomacy on the frontier. And, like many dynasties before them, the Temps cultivated strong diplomatic relationships with nomadic powers. At times, marriages sealed alliances. Temps princesses were wed to Turkic and Tibetan rulers, their bridal caravans passing through wall gates with great ceremony. The wall thus became a diplomatic theater, where envoys were welcomed, alliances forged, and treaties signed. Its gates were thresholds not just of stone, but of culture and politics. 7. The wall's new symbolism. Under the Thames, the wall was less about fear of invasion and more about imperial confidence. It marked the edge of a world that was secure, prosperous, and proud of its place as the Middle Kingdom. But paradoxically, it was precisely this confidence that allowed portions of the wall to once again fall into neglect. Because the Temps projected power far beyond their borders, the wall was not always seen as essential. It remained standing, but its role was shifting from practical defense to symbolic presence. 8. The human side of the frontier. Still, for those who lived there, farmers, soldiers, traders, the wall was not just a symbol, it was daily life. Soldiers stood watch in bitter winters, smoke rising from beacon towers when danger appeared. Families planted millet in the thin soil nearby. Children played in the shadow of watchtowers, their laughter echoing against ancient stone. And when danger came, when nomads tested the border, or when rival states sought to press into Tang territory, the wall's old purpose was not forgotten. Beacon fires flared once more, summoning armies that thundered down the frontier roads. 9. The decline of the Tang. By the 9th century, the Tang, like the Han before them, began to weaken. Internal corruption, rebellions, and rising warlord power fractured the empire. The wall, again, became neglected. Fortresses were abandoned, garrisons left unfunded, beacon towers silent. The once proud dynasty that had made the wall into a symbol of power could no longer sustain it. The frontier grew porous, and the dream of Tang dominance faded. 10. Reflection. A wall between worlds. The Sui and Tang remind us that the wall was never static. It lived and breathed with the fortunes of the dynasties that commanded it. Under the Sui, it was rebuilt through suffering and echo of the Qin. Under the Thames, it became a stage for poetry, diplomacy, and trade, a gateway to a golden age. Yet always, the wall was more than its stones. It was a mirror of empire itself, rising, falling, repurposed, reimagined, but never truly forgotten. Closing of Block 7. As night falls over the Thames frontier, we can picture the wall under starlight. A caravan halts at its gates, lanterns glowing against the stone. A poet sits upon a watchtower, composing verses by moonlight. A soldier, weary yet proud, stands watch, gazing across the vast steppe. The wall, in this moment, is not just defense. It is culture, identity, and memory. Its story woven into poetry and silk. Treaties and wars flows like the caravans that once traced their way along its shadow. And as the Temps decline, we know another cycle is beginning. Soon, the wall will once again be tested by fire, abandoned, revived, and reimagined. For the wall endures even when dynasties do not. The fall of the Tang left behind a China fractured, a vast empire broken into smaller realms, each vying for dominance. This period of turmoil, known as the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms 907–960 CE, was marked by chaos and shifting loyalties. But from this storm rose the Song Dynasty 962–1279 CE, one of the most intellectually rich and artistically vibrant eras in Chinese history. Yet for the wall, the Song era was one of vulnerability and transformation. Unlike the Han or Tang, the Song found themselves hemmed in by powerful rivals to the north, the Khitan Liao dynasty, the Jurchen dynasty, and eventually the looming storm of the Mongols. For the Great Wall, this was not a golden age of construction or pride, but rather a time of adaptation, of watching, and of bearing silent witness to the shifting tides of history. 1. The rise of the Song dynasty was born in 960 CE, when Zhao Guangyin, a brilliant general, seized power and proclaimed himself Emperor Taizu of Song. His reign, and those of his successors, brought stability to a land weary from war. The Song capital of Kaifeng flourished with art, literature, and commerce. Printing, paper money, gunpowder, and the compassul would see dramatic advances under the Song. It was a time of brilliance, where scholars debated philosophy in tea-houses, painters captured misty mountains in ink, and merchants traded along bustling canals. But for all their cultural splendor, the Song emperors struggled with one challenge above all: defense. Their military was weak compared to the formidable northern tribes, and their reliance on diplomacy and tribute shaped the fate of the wall. To the Khitan Liao dynasty north of the Song lay the He, a semi-nomadic people who established the Liao dynasty 907–1125 CE. Skilled horsemen, archers, and rulers of vast grasslands, the Khitan posed a constant threat to the Song. The wall, once a proud defense, was in disrepair by this time. Many sections crumbled, overgrown with grass, their watchtowers abandoned. Still, the frontier retained strategic value. The Song rebuilt some stretches, fortified passes, and stationed soldiers along key gates. But the days of sweeping wall construction, like under the Qin or Han, were gone. Instead, the Song often chose diplomacy over defense. Treaties, tributes, and uneasy alliances defined their relationship with the Khitan. The wall stood not so much as a bulwark against invasion, but as a witness to tense negotiations. 3. The Treaty of Chunyuan, 1005 CE. One of the most pivotal events of the Song-Liao relationship was the Treaty of Chunyuan in 1005 CE. After years of warfare, the Song agreed to pay annual tribute to the Liao in exchange for peace. Imagine the scene. At a northern frontier pass, Song officials dressed in silken robes meet Khitan emissaries clad in furs. The wall looms nearby, ancient stones weathered by centuries, its silence heavy with irony. Instead of beacon fires, it sees the exchange of silk, silver, and promises. The wall, once built to prevent nomads from breaching China's borders, now bore witness to China paying tribute to those very nomads. 4. The rise of the Jurchen. But history is never still. By the early 12th century, a new power surged forth, the Jurchen, a Tungusic people from the forests of Manchuria. They overthrew the Khitan and established the Jin dynasty 1115–1234 CE. The Jurchen were fierce, disciplined, and relentless. Their armies swept south, crushing Song defenses and capturing Kaifeng in 1127 during the catastrophic Jingkung incident. This moment shattered the Song. The imperial family was taken hostage, and the dynasty fled south, establishing what became known as the Southern Song 1127–1279 CE, with a new capital in Hangzhou. For the wall, this shift was profound. The Song had lost the northern heartlands where much of the wall stood. Those ancient stones now lay in Jurchen hands, their watchtowers no longer manned by Chinese soldiers. 5. The wall under foreign rule. Under the Jurchen, portions of the Great Wall were repaired and extended, not for the Song, but for the Jurchen themselves. The wall was no longer purely a Chinese defense. It was a prize of whoever controlled the frontier. The Jin built new fortifications and expanded older sections, particularly in areas around modern-day Hubei and Inner Mongolia. The wall was thus transformed once more, this time as part of a foreign dynasty's strategy. Meanwhile, the Southern Song, far to the south, were left without the wall as a protective barrier. They relied instead on river defenses, naval power, and strongholds along the Yangtze. The wall, once central to China's northern defense, was now beyond their reach. 6. Life on the frontier for those who lived near the wall under Jurchen rule. Life was a mixture of hardship and opportunity. Soldiers patrolled its towers, farmers tilled the soil under its shadow, and traders continued to pass through its gates. But tensions simmered. The wall was not just a military structure, it was also a line of identity. To the Jurchen, it symbolized control over China's former power. To the displaced Song, it was a painful reminder of loss. Poets of the Southern Song sometimes wrote of the wall with melancholy, imagining it abandoned or defiled by foreign hands. In their verses, the wall became a symbol of China's fractured destiny. 7. Advances in warfare during the Song era. Gunpowder weapons began to emerge in warfare. Soldiers experimented with fire arrows, explosive bombs, and early flames. Though primitive by modern standards, these weapons heralded a new age. The wall, built for cavalry raids and siege engines, was ill-prepared for this technological shift. It still stood as a mighty barrier, but the nature of warfare was changing. The thunder of hooves was now joined by the crack of gunpowder, and the wall's role would never be quite the same again. 8. The Mongol shadow. As the Jurchen and Song battled, a far greater power was rising on the steppe. In the early 13th century, Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan, began forging the Mongol tribes into an unstoppable force. The wall, already fractured between Song and Jurchen control, would soon face a storm unlike any it had known before. For the Mongols, walls were obstacles to be overcome, not barriers to halt their destiny. The wall's fate, like that of China itself, now lay in the hands of the approaching horsemen of the steppe. 9. Symbolism of the Song era. The Song dynasty's relationship with the wall was marked by distance and loss. Unlike the Han or Temes, they could not rely on it for strength. Instead, the wall became a memory, a relic of past ages of unity and defense. Yet the Song gave China something different: art, philosophy, science, and culture of extraordinary depth. Their strength was not in stone ramparts, but in the human spirit. The wall may have been beyond their grasp, but they fortified China in other ways through knowledge, beauty, and resilience. 10. Reflection. A wall in waiting. The wall in the Song era was neither dead nor thriving. It lived on in fragments, repaired by foreign rulers, remembered in poetry, and longed for by a displaced dynasty. At night, under the cold northern stars, its watchtowers still cast shadows across the plains. Beacon towers still stood, though their fires were lit by new masters. Traders still crossed its gates, though the empire that had built it was far to the south. The wall, patient as ever, waited. It had outlasted dynasties before. It would outlast them again. Closing of Block 8. As we close this chapter, we see the wall as a mirror of the Song era, fragile, fragmented, and overshadowed by greater powers, yet always enduring, always present. Soon, the Mongols will come, and the wall will face its greatest test, and in the ashes of that storm, it will find itself reborn once more. The wall had seen emperors rise and empires fall. It had endured sandstorms, sieges, and centuries of silence. Yet nothing in its long memory prepared it for the thunder that came from the steppes in the early 13th century. This was not the raid of a wandering tribe, nor the incursion of a single kingdom. This was a storm that would sweep across continents, led by a single man whose name would echo through eternity: Genghis Khan. 1. The birth of who would become Genghis Khan was born not into greatness, but into hardship. His father was poisoned, his clan abandoned him, and his childhood was a test of survival. But hardship forged steel in his spirit. Through cunning alliances, ruthless strategy, and unyielding ambition, he united the Mongol tribes under his banner. By 1206, he was declared Genghis Khan, universal ruler, and the wall, once built to contain the northern tribes, now faced a force greater than any before. The wall's towers had seen Khitan horsemen, Jurchen armies, and nomadic raids, but never had its stones trembled under the unified might of the steppe. 2. The first Mongol raids. The Mongols struck with speed and ferocity. Unlike previous nomadic foes, they were not content with plunder alone. Their campaigns were calculated, relentless, and devastating. The wall, long divided between the Song and the Jurchen, was no longer a unified line of defense. Its strength depended on the hands that held it, and those hands were already weakened. Mongol horsemen swept around sections of the wall, bypassing its fortresses by finding unguarded valleys and river crossings. For the wall, this was its first true humiliation. Not torn down by siege engines, but made irrelevant by the sheer mobility of its enemies. 3. The fall of the Jin dynasty. The Jurchen Jin, who had once held the wall as a proud frontier, bore the brunt of the Mongol onslaught. Genghis Khan's armies crushed their defenses in wave after wave. Cities fell, fields burned, and rivers ran red. By 1215, the Mongols captured Zhongdu, modern Beijing. Imagine the scene. The walls, watchtowers still stood, but their beacon fires could not save the city. Mongol banners fluttered in the smoke, black horses trampling through shattered gates. Refugees fled south, their eyes glancing back at the wall, as if expecting it to rise in their defense. But the wall could do nothing. Its stones stood mute as the Jin fell, one fortress after another, until their dynasty was no more. 4. The wall under Mongol rule. With the Jin destroyed, the Mongols now controlled the wall. Yet, unlike the Qin or Han, who had poured labor into its construction, the Mongols had little use for it. To them, walls were obstacles to conquer, not symbols to honor. They left many sections to crumble. Watchtowers grew empty, ramparts eroded, and gates stood open, no longer manned by loyal soldiers. Still, some stretches of the wall were repaired for local defense, particularly under the Mongols who settled in northern China. But in the grand vision of the Mongol Empire stretching from Korea to Hungary, the wall was but a line of stone in a world they already dominated. 5. Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty. Legacy of the wall shifted again when Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, declared the Yuan dynasty in 1271. Kublai, unlike his grandfather, embraced the trappings of Chinese rule. He moved the capital to Dadu, modern Beijing, built palaces, patronized scholars, and sought to legitimize his rule as a true emperor of China. But even under the Yuan, the wall remained secondary. The Mongols trusted their armies more than stone. Instead of expanding the wall, they expanded roads, postal stations, and networks of supply that connected their vast empire. The wall stood in quiet neglect, its stones eroding while caravans of the Silk Road passed nearby, carrying silk, porcelain, and spices to lands far beyond China's borders. 6. The human cost of conquest. The Mongol conquest was brutal beyond words. Entire cities were razed, millions perished, and survivors were scattered. For those who lived near the wall, life changed forever. Villages once protected by its ramparts now lived in fear of Mongol patrols. Farmers bent their backs under foreign tax collectors. Soldiers who once lit beacons on its towers now served foreign masters or deserted altogether. The wall, once a shield, became a silent witness to suffering. Its stones absorbed the cries of the displaced, the silence of the conquered, and the hoofbeats of conquerors who had no need for its protection. 7. The wall in Mongol imagination. To the Mongols, the wall was not a source of pride, but a trophy. Stories tell of them mocking its builders, saying that no wall could hold back the skyborn horsemen of the steppe. Yet in some ways, the wall intrigued them. Kublai Khan reportedly visited certain stretches, marveling at the scale of construction. But for the empire, he ruled a domain spanning deserts, mountains, and oceans. No single wall could matter as much as the strength of the horse and the bow. The wall became a relic, its grandeur muted under foreign dominance. 8. Cultural blending. Under the Yuan, though, the wall itself waned in importance, the Mongol era was not without cultural significance. The Yuan dynasty brought together people from across the empire. Persians, Arabs, Russians, and Central Asians lived in Chinese cities, traded goods, and shared knowledge. Near the wall, markets thrived as caravans passed through gates once guarded for war but now opened for trade. Astronomers from the Islamic world brought new instruments. Persian architects shared designs. The wall, though neglected, became part of a crossroads of cultures. Imagine a desert pass where Mongol soldiers, Chinese farmers, Persian traders, and Central Asian musicians all crossed paths, their voices echoing against the silent backdrop of ancient stone. 9. The legacy of Mongol neglected walls survived the Mongols, but it was scarred by their neglect. Sections collapsed into rubble, towers lost their roofs, grass and shrubs overtook crumbling parapets. When travelers of later centuries wrote about the wall, many described it as broken, abandoned, and forgotten in stretches. Yet, even in decay, it retained its power. It stood as a symbol of an older China, waiting to be reborn. 10. Reflection. The walls silenced the Mongols, taught the wall a harsh truth. Stone cannot protect a nation if the will of its people falters. The wall could not save the Jin. It could not stop the Mongols. It became not a shield, but a silent witness to the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And yet, in its silence, the wall endured. It waited. Just as it had outlasted Qin, Han, and Thames, it would outlast the Mongols too. For the Mongols, the wall was irrelevant. For China, it was not forgotten. In the centuries to come, when the Mongols were gone and dynasties rose again, the wall would once more find its purpose. Closing of Block 9. As we close this chapter, the wall lies in shadow, neglected under foreign rule, but like the mountains, it winds across. It remains silent, patient, eternal. For the wall knows that empires rise and fall, but stone remembers, and soon, in the fires of the Ming dynasty, it will awaken again, rebuilt into the form we recognize today. As night descended upon the sweeping expanse of the Great Wall, silence became its truest guardian. By day, the wall was alive with the creak of carts, the bark of orders, and the heavy footfall of men moving supplies along its spine. But when the sun sank, turning the horizon to an ocean of glowing amber and purple, the wall transformed into something else, an immense, breathing entity that seemed to watch the earth itself. The watch, perched at rhythmic intervals like the beads of a prayer necklace, became the sentinels of the night. Their square silhouettes rose against the moonlight, angular yet strangely poetic. Inside, the soldiers who occupied them were both protectors and dreamers, men caught between two worlds, the physical task of defense and the quiet contemplations of endless night. For these men, the wall was more than stone. It was a world unto itself. Their shifts stretched long into the darkness, when all they could hear was the sigh of the wind dragging across the ridges, the faint rustle of distant grass, and the low hum of torches burning in bowls of oil. The flicker of firelight sent shadows dancing across the cracked walls of the towers, making the ancient stones appear alive. From those high vantage points, a soldier could see forever. To the south, the land dipped into valleys where villages slept in peace, unaware of the men who kept their nightmares at bay. To the north, endless plains stretched into mystery, rolling like the back of a great beast under the starlight. Somewhere in that darkness, tribes were said to roam, riders who could cross hundreds of miles without pause, their horses carrying them like whispers of the wind. The watchmen did not know if the riders were near or far. That was the essence of their duty. Vigilance against an enemy that might not arrive for years, or could appear without warning by dawn. And so, they watched, not just with their eyes but with their hearts, listening to every creak of wood, every crunch of frost underfoot, every echo that carried across the silence. The rhythm of the nightlife inside the watchtowers followed its own steady rhythm. At dusk, torches were lit in the alcoves, casting a gentle glow that mixed with the fading light of the sky. The soldiers boiled water over small stoves, pouring steaming tea into clay cups to fight the chill of the highlands. They huddled together, passing stories like currency. These stories varied. Some spoke of home mothers stirring pots of rice, wives waiting with lanterns at village doors, children laughing in fields. Others spoke of ghosts, spirits said to wander the wall at night, the restless souls of laborers who had died during construction. And sometimes, the stories turned to legends, tales of dragons slumbering beneath the mountains, their scales hidden under the stones of the wall itself. The routine was comforting. Some men took to writing letters, carefully scratching characters onto thin sheets of paper with brushes, though they knew their words might take months to reach their families. Others sharpened weapons, not out of necessity, but habit, the slow scrape of blade against stone, blending with the night's silence. At midnight, when the moon reached its highest point, a bell was struck softly to mark the passage of time. The sound rolled across the mountains like a wave, and for a moment, the entire wall seemed to tremble with it. Then, silence resumed, thicker than before. Stars above, stones below. Was during these hours that the wall's magic revealed itself. Soldiers looked upward, and the heavens answered. Without the pollution of great cities, the sky was a tapestry of stars, each one burning as though freshly painted upon the canvas of night. The constellations were not abstract to these men. They were stories, guides, and warnings. The North Star gleamed steady, a symbol of constancy. To its side stretched the Great Bear, pointing the way like an arrow. The Milky Way spilled across the sky, a river of light that mirrored the rivers below. For many of the soldiers, it was impossible not to imagine that the wall itself had been placed in harmony with the stars, as if its stones echoed some celestial design. Some whispered that the emperors who commanded the wall's construction had been guided by the heavens, aligning its path with unseen patterns written in the night. Whether true or not, standing on the wall beneath a sea of starlight filled the men with a sense of both awe and insignificance. They were small, fragile beings perched upon an immense structure, in a world so vast it defied comprehension. And yet, they were also part of something greater, threads in the weaving of a story that spanned centuries. Bonds forged in silence within the towers. Bonds between soldiers grew strong, not because of constant talk, but because of shared silence. A nod, a passing of a steaming cup of tea, the tightening of a cloak around another man's shoulders. These gestures spoke louder than words. When one soldier dozed, another kept his place, watching the horizon for both. When food was scarce, rations were split evenly. Even when hunger gnawed at their bellies, they were, after all, keepers of the same trust that their watch would allow thousands beyond the wall to sleep without fear. Among them were men from distant provinces, each carrying their own dialects, customs, and memories, but the wall stripped them of differences. Up here, under the same winds, they were simply brothers in arms, their stories merging into one. The breath of the wind. The wall had its own language, carried by the wind. It howled through the crenellations, whispered across the stone steps, moaned in the hollow bellies of the towers. At times, the wind grew so fierce it seemed as though the wall itself was groaning under the weight of its endless duty. The men grew accustomed to this music, distinguishing between its tones, the sharp whistle of a coming storm, the soft sigh of a quiet night, the eerie wail that made hairs rise on the back of the neck. Some claimed that in those sounds, the voices of ancestors could be heard, murmuring encouragement or warnings. And when the wind stilled, the silence was even more profound, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Those were the moments when the soldiers leaned forward, straining their ears for any hint of movement in the dark. Echoes of hoofs. Sometimes, in the deepest hours, a sound broke the monotony, the faint, rhythmic thudding of hooves on distant earth. It might be only imagination, or the echo of a horse in some far-off village, but every soldier stiffened when they heard it. Eyes scanned the horizon, hands tightened on weapons, hearts quickened. Most often, the sound faded, leaving only the hum of the night, but on rare occasions, the hoofbeats grew louder, rolling like thunder across the plains. Then, alarm drums were struck. Fires were lit along the wall's length, their smoke rising as signals to towers further away. In such moments, the wall awakened, no longer just a sleeping giant, but a serpent with fire in its veins. Even when no attack followed, the memory of those sounds lingered, etching themselves into the hearts of the watchmen. A place between worlds. By dawn, the sky lightened, painting the mountains in strokes of rose and gold. The men blinked in the sudden warmth of light, their night-long vigil giving way to the promise of a new day. Some leaned against the walls, exhaustion pulling at their eyelids, while others busied themselves with routine tasks, sweeping, preparing food, repairing weapons. Yet something about those nights remained with them always. To live within the towers was to live between worlds, between sleep and wakefulness, between the heavens and the earth, between fear and peace. The wall was their home, their burden, and their cathedral. Each sunrise reminded them of why they endured, because while they kept watch, the villages beyond the wall awoke unafraid. Farmers led oxen to fields, children laughed in courtyards, women filled buckets at wells. Life continued, unaware of how closely it brushed against danger, unaware of how deeply it depended on the silent guardians who stood between. The endless vigil. Thus the Great Wall was more than a barrier. It was a living rhythm, pulsing with the heartbeat of men who served upon it, their whispers, their laughter, their fears all soaked into the stones, becoming part of the wall itself. Centuries later, when visitors would climb those towers and gaze upon the same stars, they might wonder, what did the watchmen see? What did they feel? And if they listened closely to the wind, perhaps they would hear it, the faint murmur of soldiers long gone, still keeping watch, their vigil unbroken by time. Because the Great Wall was never only about stone and mortar. It was about the breadth of human endurance, the strength of unity, and the whispers in the watchtowers that watched over a civilization as it slept. When one thinks of the Great Wall, it is often imagined as a lonely ribbon of stone, stretching endlessly over mountains and valleys, silent except for the howling wind and the footsteps of its guardians. Yet, beyond its watchtowers and military drills, the wall was also a backdrop to moments of life, color, and celebration. For the soldiers, who bore the burden of endless nights and days, festivals were the heartbeat of joy against the constant march of duty. These celebrations were rare, but when they came, they transformed the solemn battlements into stages of light and laughter. Fire cracked against the darkness, lanterns swayed in the breeze, and the ancient stones resonated with the sound of music and human voices, rather than the silence of watchfulness. The Lantern Festival, one of the most beloved occasions, was the Lantern Festival. Marking the first full moon of the new year, 4 men stationed far from their homes, the sight of thousands of glowing lanterns rising into the sky was more than spectacle. It was a tether to the families they missed, the villages they left behind, and the traditions they carried in their hearts. On the wall, the festival began with preparation. Soldiers carved out time from their duties to fashion lanterns from bamboo frames covered with paper, their hands rough from stone and sword, now suddenly delicate as they folded and tied. Each man's lantern carried meaning. Some painted cranes for longevity, others dragons for strength, and some inscribed poems in their uneven but heartfelt calligraphy. When night fell, torches were lit along the wall, their flames stretching like an endless necklace of fire. The watchtowers, usually stern in their silence, glowed like temples. Then, as the moon lifted high, soldiers lit the lanterns one by one. Slowly, the orbs of red, gold, and white floated upward, rising against the blackness of the northern sky. From above, the wall looked like a river of light, lanterns rising like stars, breaking free from the earth. Men watched them ascend with mist in their eyes, whispering prayers for their families, for safety, for peace. Some lanterns were carried away swiftly by the wind, soaring high into the heavens, while others wavered, spiraling before gently fading out. Each lantern was a message, ephemeral but eternal in its intent. And when the last lantern disappeared into the night, silence returned, yet a silence filled with warmth, as if the heavens themselves had answered with quiet reassurance. Drums of celebration festivals also brought sound, deep, resonant, unforgettable. Great war drums, usually reserved for alarms, were beaten in rhythm to mark celebration instead of danger. Their low thunder rolled across valleys, shaking the mountains, not with fear, but with joy. Soldiers and local villagers who sometimes climbed to the wall during festivals would dance to those drums. The stomping of feet echoed against stone, the clapping of hands carried on the air, and laughter broke the monotony of command. In those moments, it did not matter that the wall had been built as a shield of war. It became instead a bridge of culture, uniting people across distance. Flutes joined the drums, their melodies high and lilting, weaving like threads of silver through the air. String instruments sang softly in contrast, their notes trembling like voices of memory. Together, the music transformed the wall into a theater, where the heavens watched as humans celebrated their small but powerful existence. The Dance of the Dragon, perhaps the most dazzling of all festivities, was the Dragon Dance. Soldiers, hardened by months of strict duty, found themselves dressed in bright costumes, holding long poles that carried the body of a massive dragon puppet. The creature's head was carved of wood, its eyes painted wide with energy, its body stretched with shimmering fabric that rippled like scales. By day, the dragon was lifeless cloth and wood, but at night, under torches and lanterns, it came alive. Soldiers maneuvered it through the courtyards of the wall's garrisons, its head darting left and right, its body coiling and twisting. The dragon leaped and bowed, swayed and snapped, as the crowd roared with delight. For those moments, the wall was no longer a fortress, it was alive with myth. The dragon was not merely a puppet, it was a symbol of power, of protection, of the Empire's unyielding spirit. And when the dance ended, leaving the men breathless with sweat and laughter, they felt as though they had called forth a blessing that lingered in the air, hovering like a promise. Food shared among Stone's festivals also meant food, rare delicacies that broke the monotony of simple soldiers' rations. On these nights, the garrisons pooled resources, cooking together in great iron pots. Steaming dumplings stuffed with pork and cabbage were passed around, their savory aroma mingling with the smoke of the torches. Sticky rice cakes, sweetened with honey, stuck to fingers and laughter alike. Tea flowed freely, poured into clay cups, warming the body against the cold night. For some, it was a reminder of home kitchens, of the familiar clatter of bowls and chopsticks. For others, it was simply joy in the present. The knowledge that even here, atop endless stones, humanity endured not only in duty, but in festivity. And when the food was gone, bellies full, men leaned back against the parapets, gazing at the moon above. The wall seemed softer in those moments, less like a barrier of stone, and more like a gathering place. A table stretched across the mountains where people came together to share in life. Stories under the stars festivals were incomplete without stories. As the fires dwindled and the lanterns burned low, men reclined on the stone steps, their faces lit by moonlight, and told tales. Some recounted the myths of the wall's construction, the belief that dragons had guided its path, or that ghosts of fallen laborers still walked its length, ensuring it would never crumble. Others shared personal tales of lovers waiting across provinces, of fathers who had once stood on the wall before them, of journeys taken across rivers and fields to arrive here. These stories wove together, blending myth and memory, until no one could tell where history ended and imagination began. And perhaps that was the wall's true magic. It existed not only in the physical world of mortar and stone, but in the realm of stories. It was a place where personal memory joined collective myth, creating something larger than life. The quiet after, when the drums quieted, when the lanterns had flown, when the laughter faded into whispers, the wall returned to stillness. Yet it was not the same stillness as before. The stones now held warmth from the fires, echoes from the songs, the lingering taste of dumplings in the air. For the soldiers, festivals were not only brief escapes, they were reminders that life was more than vigilance, more than waiting for distant threats. Life was joy shared in fleeting moments, love carried across mountains, dreams sent skyward in fragile lanterns. As they returned to their posts, to their endless watches, the men carried these memories like armor, against the cold winds, against loneliness, against the fear of attack. They held festivals within their hearts. And so, the wall was not only a shield of stone, but also a vessel of humanity, its cracks filled with laughter, its shadows echoing with music, its towers lit not only by torches of war, but by lanterns of peace. Dawn after celebration, as the horizon blushed with the first strokes of dawn, soldiers awakened from their brief rest, sweeping ashes of fire, clearing away scraps of food, and folding the dragon puppet to rest until the next festival. The night's joy dissolved into the duties of the day. But as they climbed the towers, gazing across the vast lands, there was a lightness in their hearts, for they knew that though duty was unending, joy was not absent. And when the next festival came, the wall would once again bloom with light and music, as though even the stones themselves longed to celebrate. The Great Wall, in all its enormity, had been built for defense, yet, against the stars, it became a stage for humanity's gentlest truths, that even in the shadow of war, people dream, laugh, and dance. When one imagines the Great Wall, visions of soldiers with spears and bows often come first, vigilant men guarding the empire against raiders from the north. But to see only the wall's military role is to glimpse just one side of its immense history. Beyond its battlements and garrisons, the wall also became a silent witness to the flow of trade, to the passage of merchants, and to the birth of cultural exchange. The wall did not merely keep enemies out, it also stood at the edge of the world's greatest marketplace, a frontier where goods, ideas, and people moved like restless winds. And so, under its shadow, caravans of camels jingled with bells, horsemen galloped with messages bound in silk, and the faint whispers of distant lands reached even the quietest of watchtowers. The meeting of two worlds. To the south of the wall lay the heart of China, fertile plains, bustling towns, imperial capitals, and fields heavy with grain. To the north stretched the vast steppes and deserts, lands of horsemen, nomads, and winds so fierce they carried voices across miles. The wall stood not just as a barrier, but as a threshold, marking the meeting place of two different worlds. Through the gaps of gates and passes carved into the wall, trade routes emerged like veins. Among them, none was more important than the legendary Silk Road. This network of paths extended across deserts and mountains, linking China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually the Mediterranean world. As caravans approached the wall, their shadows stretched long under the sun. Merchants led camels laden with bolts of silk, baskets of tea, jars of porcelain. In exchange, They brought precious metals, glassware, spices, and stories from lands most soldiers could scarcely imagine. The Great Wall was not only stone and watchtower, it was a silent spectator of humanity's desire to connect. Caravans under the stars, picture, if you will, a caravan moving at dusk. The wall's silhouette looms against the horizon, its towers black against the burning colors of sunset. Dozens of camels sway in a slow procession, their hooves leaving soft prints in the sand. Bells jingle faintly, creating a rhythm that matches the slow breath of the desert wind. Merchants walk alongside, their robes flowing, their faces half hidden in cloth against the dust. They speak in many tongues: Chinese, Persian, Turkic, Arabic, each word carrying echoes of distant homelands. Some share jokes to lighten the fatigue, others hum tunes that remind them of home. At night, as the stars emerge, they camp near the wall's shadow. Fires are lit, cooking pots hiss, and the scent of spiced stew drifts into the air. Soldiers, drawn by curiosity, approach to watch or trade a few coins for exotic goods. In the flickering firelight, stories are told. Tales of distant cities with golden domes, of seas where the horizon never ends, of markets where everything under heaven could be bought or sold. The Great Wall, immovable and unchanging, bore silent witness to this dance of movement and exchange. Goods of wonder. The wall's garrisons were often the first place where exotic goods entered China. Imagine a soldier, accustomed only to the iron tools and clay pots of daily life, suddenly seeing Venetian glass sparkle in the torchlight, or touching a roll of embroidered fabric from India. For many, it was like holding a piece of another world in their calloused hands. From China flowed silk, a material so prized it became synonymous with wealth and refinement. Rolls of silk shimmered like liquid under the sun, dyed in colors that seemed to capture the very essence of nature: deep reds of autumn leaves, golden yellows of ripe fields, blues of the endless sky. In return came goods just as wondrous. Spices like cinnamon, cardamom, and cloves arrived, their scents intoxicating soldiers who had never before tasted such flavors. Horses from Central Asia, powerful and swift, were traded to strengthen the empire's cavalry. Precious stones and metals gleamed in markets set up near wall passes, tempting both merchants and generals alike. And beyond material goods, ideas traveled: mathematics from the Middle East, art and music from India, medical knowledge from faraway scholars. The wall may have been a fortress, but it could not keep out the flow of imagination. Messengers of the empire. Trade was not the only thing that passed along the wall. Messages, too, coursed across its length like lifeblood. For the empire, communication was survival. Without it, soldiers could not be supplied, threats could not be warned, victories could not be shared. The wall became a highway for couriers, men trained to ride swiftly, carrying bamboo slips or silk scrolls with imperial commands. Horses thundered along dirt paths parallel to the wall, their hooves pounding like drums of urgency. At night, when travel grew dangerous, these messengers relied on fire signals from towers' flames, leaping into the sky to mark danger or summon reinforcements. Some messages were mundane, reports of supplies or troop movements. Others carried the weight of history: news of invasions, decrees of emperors, summons of generals. To the soldiers who received them, these messages were threads binding the far reaches of the empire together. The wall, in this sense, was not merely stone, it was an artery, pulsing with information, carrying the empire's lifeblood from one end to the other. Border towns, markets of many tongues around the wall's gates. Small towns often sprouted like moss at the base of stone. These were border markets, where merchants, travelers, and locals gathered. Imagine streets filled with stalls, silk bolts rolled neatly on wooden racks, spices piled into pyramids of color, ceramics glistening under sunlight. The air buzzed with a dozen languages. A Turkic trader haggled over the price of a jade pendant with a Chinese craftsman. A Persian merchant demonstrated glass bottles that glowed in torchlight, while a Central Asian horse dealer boasted of steeds unmatched in endurance. For soldiers who lived in isolation, these markets were windows to the wider world. A soldier might spend his meager pay on a trinket from far away, or simply linger to watch the bustle. In the laughter of bargaining, in the clink of coins, in the mingling of scents and colors, life pulsed vibrantly at the wall's edges. The exchange of ideas, perhaps the most remarkable treasure to flow across the wall, was not silk or jade, but thought itself. Ideas traveled with merchants, carried invisibly in conversations and practices. Alongside camels laden with goods, there moved philosophies, religious beliefs, and ways of life. Buddhism entered China through these very routes, carried by monks who walked alongside caravans. With them came scriptures, statues, and teachings that would forever alter Chinese spirituality. Mathematics and astronomy from the Middle East filtered in, enriching local knowledge. Artistic motifs traveled both ways. Chinese dragons inspired patterns far to the west, while Persian designs influenced local weavings. The wall, intended as a fortress, became a bridge of culture. In its shadow, languages blended, faiths intertwined, and the world grew smaller, more connected. The night watch of merchants, but trade and exchange were not without risk. For every caravan that passed safely, there were those who vanished into deserts or fell prey to raiders. The wall was a guardian, but it could not shield all travelers. Merchants camping near the wall would sometimes glance nervously at its looming silhouette, seeking comfort in its presence. Fires were kept low to avoid attracting attention. Guards slept lightly, hands resting on the hilts of knives. Stories of bandits circulated in hushed tones, reminding all that wealth on the Silk Road was a prize as much as a burden. Yet, even in fear, the wall offered reassurance. Its towers dotted the horizon like stars fallen to earth, their watchful eyes promising at least some measure of safety. Dawn of trade. When dawn broke, caravans resumed their march, disappearing into deserts and mountains, their paths uncertain. Soldiers watched them go, their figures shrinking until they were no more than dust on the horizon. And still, the wall remained unmoved, a silent monument to the endless tide of human movement. Through centuries, countless caravans passed, countless goods exchanged, countless ideas shared. Each left a trace, however faint, in the memory of the wall. And though the wall had been raised to guard against invasion, it became something far richer, a witness to the mingling of civilizations, a keeper of connections across worlds. Reflection. As night returned and the wall lay under starlight, it seemed to hum with memories. Soldiers on watch duty could almost hear the echo of caravan bells, the chatter of merchants, the laughter of markets. The stones, though silent, held these whispers, carrying them forward through the ages. And perhaps that was the wall's truest role, not only as protector, but as observer. For though men built it to guard borders, the wall came to stand at the heart of humanity's greatest journey, the journey of connection, of trade, of ideas that spanned the earth. In its shadow, silk gleamed, spices burned with scent, languages mingled, and the world became smaller. The Great Wall was not just a shield, it was a stage where civilizations met, spoke, traded, and dreamed. When the laborers and craftsmen finally laid down their tools, when the dust settled on the freshly tamped earth and stone, the Great Wall's task had only just begun, for it was not enough to build a barrier. It had to be watched, lived upon, and defended. The guardians of the Great Wall, the soldiers, the watchers, the sentinels of empire, became the living heart of its existence. Their lives, their nights, and their endless vigil against both enemies and loneliness formed a story as vast as the wall itself. This block carries us into their world. The transformation of the wall into a fortress. Though it began as simple ramparts and trenches, the wall soon grew into something more, a fortress stretched thin across the mountains, deserts, and plains. Towers punctuated its length, each one a heartbeat in a long body of stone. Barracks sprouted at strategic points, and storerooms held grain, weapons, and salted meat. But no matter how strong the wall was, without men to stand upon it, it was only a silent ridge of earth. The soldiers gave it voice, purpose, and vigilance. Who were the guardians? The men stationed along the wall came from many paths. Conscripts, pulled from villages to serve years of duty, leaving behind fields and families. Professional soldiers, hardened by campaigns, who now took up a slower but no less dangerous life guarding the frontier. Criminals or exiles, whose punishment was not labor but endless service, watching the barren horizons for raiders who might never come. Together, they formed a patchwork of humanity, united by duty but divided by longing for home, for freedom, for rest. Daily life on the wall. A soldier's day began before sunrise. As the first light stretched across the steppe or desert, horns were blown or drums beaten to rouse the garrisons. Morning drills prepared men for attacks that might come at any moment. Archery practice, sword training, and simulated maneuvers kept their skills sharp. Maintenance was just as vital, repairing broken bricks, clearing debris from battlements, checking fire beacons, and ensuring weapons were oiled and ready. Patrols moved along the wall, pairs or groups of men scanning the horizon. To patrol was to walk, not just miles, but sometimes entire days. for the wall stretched beyond imagination. Meals were simple: millet, porridge, dried vegetables, occasionally pork or fish, if supplies permitted. The rations were meager, and hunger was a constant companion. Yet the rhythm of meals gave structure to days that might otherwise stretch endlessly. At night, soldiers rotated through watch duty, standing under the stars, their breath misting in cold air. They listened for the faintest sound: hoofbeats on grass, voices on the wind. Most nights passed in silence, but vigilance was its own burden. The beacon towers, the walls, nervous system. Of the most ingenious features of the Great Wall was its network of beacon towers. From these high outposts, soldiers could light fires or release smoke signals to warn of enemy movement. In daylight, smoke spirals rose against the sky. At night, flames cut through the darkness. This system was so effective that messages could travel hundreds of miles in a single day, faster than any horseman. A raid spotted at one frontier could alert garrisons across provinces, sending reinforcements racing to the threatened zone. But to the men stationed there, the beacons were both lifeline and torment. Watching an empty horizon for weeks or months, they wondered whether the next fire they lit might summon armies, or whether their lonely vigil would continue, unbroken, until their hair turned gray. The ever-present threat, the wall's very existence, was born of fear. The fear of raids from nomadic tribes, Zumnu Mongols, and countless others who swept across the steppes with speed unmatched by farmers or infantry. Soldiers on the wall lived under this constant threat. Scouts sometimes vanished into the grasslands and never returned. Watchers spotted smoke from distant camps, knowing that riders might soon be upon them. Battles were not daily, but the possibility of battle was. That possibility weighed on every man, every shift, every step along the ramparts. The loneliness of the watch, yet more than the enemy, the greatest adversary, was loneliness. The wall stretched across some of the most desolate landscapes on earth. Barren deserts, frozen mountains, endless plains. To be stationed there was often to be cut off from family and community for years. Letters home were rare, carried slowly by official couriers. Visits were nearly impossible. Many soldiers grew old on the wall without ever seeing their parents or wives again. Some took comfort in comradeship, sharing wine brewed in secret, singing folk songs under the stars, carving messages into the bricks. Others slipped into despair, staring at the horizon until it blurred into nothingness. In this way, the wall tested not only the body but the soul. Stories, rituals, and bonds. Humanity, however, is resilient even in hardship. Soldiers found ways to pass time, to build meaning into their isolated lives. Storytelling flourished around campfires. Men told tales of heroes and ghosts, of dragons and emperors, of wives who waited faithfully or who remarried too soon. Rituals gave structure to endless days. Offerings were made at shrines built near barracks, prayers whispered to ancestors for protection. Brotherhood grew strong. Bonds formed not just of duty but of shared suffering. Men watched each other's backs in battle, patched each other's wounds, and shared whatever small joys could be found. The wall was stone, but it was also community, fragile, makeshift, but deeply human. The wall and the stars, perhaps the most poetic element of a soldier's life, was the night sky. Far from cities, the heavens stretched vast and brilliant. The Milky Way arched overhead, constellations rose and fell with the seasons, and the moon bathed the stones in silver light. Men leaned against the battlements, gazing upward as generations before them had done. Some studied the stars as navigators, learning to tell time and direction. Others simply dreamed of home, of freedom, of lives unlived on. And in those quiet moments, the Great Wall itself seemed to merge with the cosmos, a line of stone below, a river of stars above, both eternal, both stretching beyond human grasp. Legacy of the Watchers, though emperors and generals claimed credit for the Great Wall. It was these soldiers, the nameless guardians, who gave it life. Without them, it would have been abandoned, swallowed by time. Their vigilance, their patience, their sacrifices kept the wall breathing through centuries. Many were buried in shallow graves near their posts, never to see home again. Yet their legacy endures in the very stones they once walked, in the stories passed down, in the silent majesty of the wall itself. Closing reflection for Block 13. To imagine the Great Wall without its soldiers is to imagine a body without blood. They were its pulse, its heartbeat in the wilderness. They endured hunger, cold, loneliness, and danger, not for glory but because duty demanded it. As we stand on its ramparts today, we walk in their footsteps. Each brick whispers of their presence. Each tower holds the echo of their watch, and under the same stars they once gazed upon, we feel a bond across centuries, a recognition that their lives, though forgotten, were the true defense of a civilization. The Great Wall may have been built to last, but it was lived in by men whose dreams were fragile, fleeting, and profoundly human. The Great Wall was not merely a monument of stone and earth, it was a meeting place between worlds, the settled farmlands of China and the wide-open steppes of the north. On one side lay fields, rivers, villages, and cities bound together by dynasties. On the other stretched an ocean of grass, where herds grazed and nomadic tribes roamed with the wind. It was here, across this fragile line, that some of history's fiercest clashes unfolded. For while the wall was mighty, it was never beyond challenge. Against it rode the Mongols, warriors of the steppe, born in the saddle, as swift as shadows across the plain. Their thunder would echo along the ramparts, testing the strength not only of stone but of human resolve. The world of the steppe. Before we understand the Mongol challenge, we must first picture their home. The northern steppe was a land of vast horizons, where the earth seemed endless and the sky boundless. Here, men and women lived, not in permanent towns but in tents, called gairs or yurts, moving with their herds of horses, sheep, and cattle. Every child learned to ride before they could walk. Every man carried a bow. Every woman knew how to tend animals and pack camps swiftly. Life on the steppe was harsh but free. Seasons dictated survival. Bitter winters, scorching summers, fleeting springs, and short-lived autumns. From this environment came resilience, speed, and adaptability. Nomads could appear suddenly at the edge of farmland, strike with terrifying precision, and vanish into the plains before defenders could rally. Early raids, even before the rise of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, northern tribes harried China's borders. The Xiongnu, centuries earlier, had been the first to push the emperors of Qin and Han into building fortifications. Later came the Turks, Hetans, and Jurchens, each wave testing the strength of the wall and the resolve of those behind it. To farmers living near the frontier, these raids were more than distant tales. They were moments of terror. Smoke on the horizon meant horsemen were coming. Villages could be plundered in minutes, livestock stolen, families torn apart. The wall, therefore, became more than stone. It was a promise that watchtowers would send warnings, that soldiers would hold the line, that life behind the wall could continue. The rise of the Mongols, and then came the Mongols. In the 13th century, a leader named Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, united the fractious tribes of the steppe under a single banner. What followed was not merely raids but conquest on a scale the world had never seen. Mongol horsemen thundered across Asia and into Europe, their bows outshooting infantry, their strategies outwitting kings and emperors. For China, the threat was overwhelming. The wall, though strong, was not impenetrable. The Mongols knew how to test its weaknesses by bribing corrupt officials, by waiting for sections to decay, by simply riding around in regions where it did not yet extend. Battles at the ramparts. Imagine a garrison of soldiers standing watch atop a lonely tower. Dust rises on the horizon. Not a few riders, but hundreds, then thousands. The beat of hooves grows louder. Like a storm rolling across the land, the soldiers light the beacon fires, sending signals racing across the wall. Horns sound, drums thunder, and arrows are fitted to bowstrings. The Mongols charge, swift and disciplined. They do not waste themselves on the wall itself, but circle, probing for weaknesses, luring defenders into ambushes. Their arrows whistle through the air, finding gaps between shields. Their horses move with uncanny speed, able to stop, turn, and sprint in an instant. Such clashes were rarely won. Sometimes the wall held firm, defenders pushing back raiders with volleys of arrows and spears. At other times, villages behind the wall were left in ruins, their protection bypassed or overwhelmed. The Mongol strategy. What made the Mongols so formidable was not brute strength but strategy. They mastered the art of feigned retreat, pretending to flee, only to turn back suddenly and envelop their pursuers. They coordinated with smoke signals of their own, moving in waves of cavalry that struck with precision. Even when faced with towering walls, they adapted. Siege engines, borrowed from conquered enemies, became part of their arsenal. Catapults hurled stones, battering rams struck gates, and ladders scaled defenses, thought unbreachable. The Great Wall was vast, but no wall could stretch everywhere. The Mongols exploited these gaps. Where stone ended, their horses began. Where guards grew lax, their raids surged. life under the shadow. For those living in the shadow of these riders, life was uncertain. Farmers sowed fields knowing they might never reap harvests. Children grew up hearing both lullabies and warnings that if they strayed too far, horsemen might snatch them away. And yet, despite this fear, life persisted. The wall, though tested, gave enough protection for civilization to continue flourishing inside its embrace. Cities thrived, scholars wrote, and trade routes expanded. Even as the frontier smoldered with tension, the wall and the eternal sky, there was a strange poetry in this endless contest. The wall stretched beneath the heavens, while the Mongols rode under the same stars. Both saw themselves as rightful heirs of the land, the farmers and emperors who built the wall to keep peace within, and the nomads who believed the open steppe was their eternal inheritance. At night, soldiers on the wall gazed at the stars, wondering if riders beyond the horizon did the same. Perhaps a Mongol boy, resting by his horse, looked upward tracing the Milky Way and dreaming of conquest that was not only stone against horse, but vision against vision. Two ways of life, both enduring, both ancient. The Ming response. Centuries later, during the Ming Dynasty, the wall was rebuilt stronger than ever. Stone replaced earth, towers rose taller, and garrisons grew more permanent. This new wall, stretching over 5,500 miles, was designed specifically to withstand the Mongol threat, and for a time, it worked. Mongol incursions lessened, trade grew steadier, and the line between empire and steppe held more firmly. Yet even then, the wall could not silence the beating hooves forever. A bedtime reflection as we drift deeper into this story. The clash of civilizations softens into memory. The Mongols are no longer charging. The fires on the towers have long since gone out. What remains is the whisper of history, carried on the wind that once rustled the grass of the steppe. The wall stands still, quiet under the stars. It remembers the thunder of hooves, the shouts of battle, the silence after the storm. It remembers both sides, the builders who stacked stones, and the riders who tested them. And now, under the same sky, the wall is no longer a line of division but a bridge of memory, a reminder that history is not only stone and blood but dreams and resilience, of farmers who longed for peace, of horsemen who longed for freedom, of a civilization that endured despite all. The Great Wall was never the work of one man, nor even one generation. It was a story written across centuries, each dynasty leaving its mark, each ruler weaving their own dream into its stones. To walk along its winding path today is not only to follow a barrier of defense, but to travel through time itself, where Qin bricks touch Han towers, where Thames watchtowers crumble into dust, and where the proud Ming stones still stand tall. The Qin beginning. The tale begins with the Qin dynasty, under the iron will of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. He is remembered as the unifier of China, the builder of vast roads, the commander of armies, and the ruler who sought immortality. But perhaps nothing symbolizes his ambition more than his order to link together the scattered walls of earlier kingdoms. Before his rise, the states of northern China had each built fortifications to defend their own borders. These walls were like scattered threads, unconnected, vulnerable, isolated. Qin Shi Huang envisioned something greater, a single line, stretching like a dragon's spine, binding his empire together. The labor was immense. Hundreds of thousands of workers, soldiers, peasants, even convicts, were forced to toil. Stones were heaved, earth was rammed, and timber was carried over mountains. The work was brutal, the conditions harsh, and many lives were lost along the way. Legends tell of skeletons buried within the wall itself, though the truth is more that exhaustion and exposure claimed countless souls. Yet from their sacrifice rose a monument that declared the power of a new empire. The Qin Wall was not as mighty as what we see today, but it was a beginning, the first attempt to shape the land itself into a shield. The Han expansion centuries later. Under the Han dynasty, the wall grew once again. The Han emperors looked northward and saw the ever-present threat of the Xiongnu, fierce riders of the steppe. To protect their lands in the flourishing Silk Road, they extended the wall farther and reinforced its defenses. It was during the Han era that the wall became more than a barricade. It became a lifeline for trade. Watchtowers guarded not only fields and villages but also caravans laden with silk, spices, and precious goods that traveled westward. The wall stood as both shield and signpost, guiding merchants along safe routes and warning them of danger. Life along the Han Wall was vibrant. Soldiers kept watch in towers, but nearby towns bustled with markets. Traders brought goods from faraway lands, Persia, India, even Rome. The wall was not only a division between worlds, but a bridge between them, standing as witness to an age of connection. The Sui and Temps interlude. The centuries rolled on, dynasties rose and fell. During the Sui and Tem periods, the wall was less emphasized. The Temps, confident in their strength, extended their influence far beyond the frontier. Instead of leaning on walls, they rode into the steppe, forging alliances, marrying with nomadic tribes, and building an empire of diplomacy as well as war. Yet even as the wall's importance faded for a time, it remained, weathering storms and sun, its stones slowly crumbling but its spirit unbroken. Travelers passed by its ruins, marveling at the ambition of ancestors who had tried to hold back the endless steppe. The Northern Song and the Jurchenchen, the Song dynasty rose. They faced new threats from the north, the Hetans and the Jurchens. These horsemen tested China's defenses once again. The Song, less militaristic and more focused on culture and trade, struggled to hold the frontier. They relied more on diplomacy, tribute, and alliances than on the wall. But the wall was never far from memory. In times of crisis, emperors would repair sections, fortify towers, and send soldiers to man the crumbling ramparts. It was like a sleeping dragon, called upon whenever danger grew near. The Yuan dynasty Mongol rule. Then came the Mongols, sweeping down in unstoppable waves, conquering the land and establishing the Yuan dynasty. Under their rule, the Great Wall fell into neglect. Why would rulers from the steppe need a wall to defend against themselves? To them, the wall was not a shield but a relic of an older time, unnecessary in their new order. Many sections fell into ruin. Villages abandoned their watchtowers. Stones were scavenged for houses. Timber burned for warmth. The wall, once a proud sentinel, became a ghost, fading into the landscape. The Ming rebirth. But history is never still. After the fall of the Yuan, the Ming dynasty rose, determined to reclaim and secure China's lands. The memory of Mongol invasions burned fiercely, and the Ming emperors resolved to build a wall that could truly withstand the fury of the north. This was the Great Wall as we know it today, no longer just tamped earth or scattered stones. The Ming Wall was a masterpiece of engineering. Granite, blocks, bricks, and lime mortar created fortifications that could last centuries. Watchtowers rose at regular intervals, connected by broad walkways wide enough for horses and carts. Beacons were placed so signals could race across hundreds of miles and hours. The Ming Wall stretched over 5,500 miles, winding across deserts, mountains, and rivers. It was not only a military defense but also a symbol of unity and determination. Life along the Ming Wall was harsh but organized. Garrisons were stationed permanently. Farmers lived nearby, growing food for the soldiers. Families settled, forming small towns beneath the shadow of the towers. And always, soldiers watched through scorching summers, freezing winters, and the endless winds of the north. The human cost and legacy yet behind this grandeur lay immense human cost. Just as in Qin times, the labor was back. Men carried stones up sheer cliffs. Women hauled water for mortar. Children worked as runners between camps. Countless lives were sacrificed to build this wall of stone and brick, a silent testimony of both suffering and ambition. And yet, for all the pain, the wall endured. It stood through centuries of raids, invasions, and wars. It became a symbol not just of defense, but of endurance itself. Proof that civilizations could carve permanence out of impermanence, that dreams could be built into the earth. A bedtime reflection as we close our eyes to this chapter. We see the Great Wall not as a single thing but as a living story. It was born under Qin, expanded by Han, forgotten by Temps, neglected under Yuan, and reborn in splendor under Ming. It is not merely stone but memory, not merely defense, but a testament to centuries of hope and fear, struggle and triumph. When the night wind brushes against the mountains where the wall still lies, it seems to carry voices from all these ages. The grunt of Qin laborers, the cry of Han traders, the laughter of Temps poets, the thunder of Mongol hooves, the commands of Ming generals, all of them are part of the wall, all of them live on in its stones. And as we drift deeper into sleep, we carry with us the knowledge that every great work of humanity is not one moment but many, a chorus across centuries, a legacy woven through time, enduring as long as memory itself. The Great Wall of China, for all its grandeur, was not only a monument of emperors and stone, it was also a living frontier, home to countless men, women, and children who gave it breath and meaning. Soldiers who watched through the night, farmers who tilled the land beneath its shadow, merchants who passed through its gates, and children who played where earth and sky met stone. All were part of its story. To truly understand the Great Wall, we must step away from emperors and dynasties, and instead walk among the ordinary lives that pulsed against its vast spine. The soldiers on the wall. Imagine yourself standing atop the wall on a winter morning. The wind bites your face, sharp as blades. Below, endless snow blankets the mountains, turning watchtowers into silent ghosts. A soldier, wrapped in fur and wool, leans against the cold stone, scanning the horizon for signs of smoke, for smoke meant riders, and riders meant war. These soldiers lived lives of discipline and endurance. They were not kings, nor heroes in stories, but guardians of a boundary between two worlds. Their duty, soldiers were posted in watchtowers spaced so carefully that each could see the other, allowing for signals to be sent quickly across hundreds of miles. They lit beacon fires at night, raised flags by day, and passed messages along like a chain of lightning. A single spark in the far west could reach the imperial capital within hours. Their routine, their days began at dawn with roll call. Some patrolled the wall's length, marching for miles along the uneven stones. Others repaired cracks, fetched water, or trained in archery and swordplay. At night, they rotated shifts, taking turns to keep watch while their comrades rested. Their burden: many soldiers served for years, far from their families. Some were conscripts, punished for crimes or unable to pay taxes, forced to serve in harsh outposts. Others were veterans rewarded with land near the frontier. Loneliness was their companion, and discipline their survival. Yet amidst the hardship, life found small rhythms. Soldiers carved graffiti into the wall, wrote letters home, shared bowls of hot millet porridge, or sang songs under the stars. In their voices, the wall became not only stone but human. Villagers beneath the wall. Where there are soldiers, there must also be those who feed them. At the foot of the wall, small villages sprouted like roots beneath a towering tree. Farmers grew wheat, millet, and sorghum in the valleys. They raised pigs, chickens, and goats, sending much of their harvest upward to the garrisons. In return, soldiers offered protection from raids. Daily life: at dawn, women carried water in clay jars while men worked the fields. Children ran barefoot through the dust, chasing goats or playing near the gates of the wall. Smoke curled from hearths, carrying the scent of boiling dumplings or steaming rice. Trade and market. Markets were held on certain days near checkpoints. Merchants from faraway lands brought goods, spices, furs, teas, and silks. Farmers sold vegetables, while craftsmen mended shoes or sharpened blades. These markets turned the frontier into a place of exchange, where cultures mixed as easily as voices in a crowd. But life near the wall was never without danger. Raids could erupt suddenly. Villagers sometimes fled to the shadow of the wall, seeking shelter behind its stones as soldiers rushed to their defense. The bond between soldier and villager was one of necessity. Without one, the other could not survive. Watchtowers and garrisons. The watchtowers, scattered like lanterns along the wall, were more than posts for soldiers. They were small worlds of their own. Inside a tower, one might find sleeping mats, rough straw beds where soldiers huddled together for warmth, cooking pots, a small clay oven for making simple meals, rice, porridge, dried meat, weapons, racks, bows, arrows, spears, and swords, neatly stored for quick access, signal supplies, bundles of firewood, oil, and straw for lighting beacons at a moment's notice. In larger garrisons, life was more structured. Barracks held hundreds of soldiers. Training grounds rang with the clash of spears. Horses were stabled, ready for patrol. Blacksmiths repaired armor, tailors mended uniforms, and scribes kept records. The garrisons were not only fortresses, they were communities. Families sometimes lived within their walls. Children growing up hearing stories of battles fought long before their birth. Food, festivals, and survival life on the frontier could be harsh, but it was not without moments of joy. Meals: soldiers ate rations of millet, beans, dried vegetables, and occasionally meat. Villagers shared dumplings during festivals, sometimes gifting them to soldiers as tokens of gratitude. In cold winters, hot soups kept spirits alive. Festivals, even on the edge of empire, traditions endured. During the Lunar New Year, red lanterns glowed against the gray stone of the wall. Soldiers lit fireworks, not only for celebration but also to remind themselves of home. Farmers offered sacrifices to the gods of harvest, hoping for fertile soil and safe seasons. Storytelling. In the evenings, when duties were done, people gathered around fires. Elders told tales of dragons and heroes, while soldiers recounted battles or spun jokes to lighten heavy hearts. These stories wove the fabric of community, binding people together as tightly as the wall itself bound the empire. The human side of a monument. It is easy to imagine the Great Wall as only stone, cold and silent. But in truth, it was alive. Every watchtower echoed with voices. Every gate bore the footprints of countless travelers. Every stretch of stone carried the weight of human dreams and fears. Think of the boy who grew up in a village beneath the wall, hearing soldiers call to one another. Think of the young conscript who marched north, heart heavy with homesickness, but who found a family among comrades. Think of the merchant who paused at the gate, gazing up at the massive stonework and whispering prayers for safe passage. Each of them left something behind, perhaps not in stone, but in memory. And it is this memory that makes the Great Wall more than a line of defense. It is a line of humanity, a bedtime reflection as we drift into sleep. Let us not see the Great Wall only as a barrier of emperors and wars. Let us see it as a place of lives lived in the quiet spaces. Between battles, it was in the laughter of children chasing kites in the shadow of towers. It was in the calloused hands of farmers who bent over fields, knowing their work fed not just families but soldiers guarding the frontier. It was in the weary sighs of soldiers who leaned against the cold stones, watching the stars wheel above them, dreaming of distant homes. The Great Wall was not only a wall of stone, it was a wall of people, each one a thread in a tapestry that stretched across centuries. And tonight, as we close our eyes, we too walk among them, hearing their voices, feeling their hopes, and knowing that the true strength of the Great Wall lay not only in its stones, but in the beating hearts that stood beside it. The Great Wall of China was not just a wall. To see it merely as stone and mortar is to miss the hidden brilliance behind its creation. It was a living system, a vast network of towers, fortresses, trenches, and roads that worked together like the nerves of a giant body. Each section of the wall was designed with strategy in mind. It was not only meant to repel, but to anticipate. It was not only meant to protect, but to guide. It was, in many ways, one of the most intricate defense systems the world had ever seen. As we explore its genius tonight, let us do so slowly, gently, like tracing the lines of an old map by candlelight. Allow the details to unfold, one by one, like stars appearing in the sky, beacons of light, the language of fire and smoke perhaps. The most brilliant invention along the wall was not its stone, but its signals. The beacon towers, scattered at careful intervals, towers were raised above mountain ridges and valleys. At night, a single torch could become a blazing fire, sending a message miles away. In daylight, bundles of straw or wolf dung created thick, dark smoke, visible across great distances. The code, the system, was simple yet effective. One column of smoke might mean a small raiding party. 2 columns could mean hundreds of riders. 3 meant thousands. By the time 5 plumes rose into the sky, the warning was clear. An invasion was underway. Speed of the message. Imagine this. A riderless horse appears on the horizon. Within minutes, a watchman lights a fire. The tower down the line sees it, then passes it on. In hours, the signal can reach the imperial capital, hundreds of miles away. What once took days by messenger could now travel in the time it takes the sun to set. For soldiers on the wall, these fires were lifelines. For raiders, they were nightmares, knowing that their secrecy vanished with a single spark. The wall, as terrain, the wall itself was more than stone. It was terrain reshaped into a weapon. Mountain ridges, where possible, the wall was built atop ridges, turning steep slopes into natural barriers. Enemies were forced to climb uphill, exhausted before even reaching the gates. River crossings. In places where rivers cut through, the wall met the water with fortresses and gates, controlling trade and blocking invaders who tried to slip through along riverbanks. Deserts in the north, where sands stretched endlessly, the wall became more than stone. It turned into ditches, earthen embankments, and wooden fortifications. In some areas, reeds were woven into walls, later hardened by clay. Even the emptiness of the desert became part of the defense. It was a system of adaptability, each section shaped by the land it crossed, proving that the wall was not rigid but alive, bending with the earth like a great serpent. The art of Dalatha wall was not meant to be impenetrable. The emperors knew this. Raiders could always find cracks, a weak garrison, an unguarded gate. a night of storms. But the genius of the wall was not absolute defense, it was delay. Time was power. By slowing invaders, even for a day, the wall gave time for reinforcements to arrive. Raiders might breach one section, but they could not do so quietly. The wall ensured the empire always had the advantage of knowing choke points. Gates and valleys became traps. Raiders funneled into narrow passes found themselves surrounded by archers. Soldiers hidden in towers released arrows from above. What seemed like an entry often became a death trap. Psychological edge. Even before a single arrow flew, the wall loomed as a deterrent. To approach it was to face not only stone, but the invisible knowledge that behind it stood legions waiting, garrisons and mobility beyond its stones. The wall was alive with movement. Troop rotation. Soldiers were not fixed to one tower forever. Garrisons shifted men between posts, ensuring that no one grew complacent and every section remained sharp. Hidden roads. Along the wall ran secret roads wide enough for horses and carts. Supplies, weapons, and reinforcements could move quickly, concealed from the enemy. Mobile forces. Cavalry units patrolled behind the wall, ready to ride out when signals flared. They were the striking hand of the wall, turning defense into counterattack. In this way, the wall was not passive stone but the spine of a flexible, living army. The intelligence web defense was not only about strength, but about knowledge. Spies and scouts, sent northward into the steppes. Scouts disguised as traders or wanderers brought back whispers of movement. How many riders had gathered? Where were they camped? Were they preparing for war or only for trade? Local knowledge. Villagers along the frontier often acted as ears of the wall. A stranger passing through, a rumor of horses stolen, or a sudden shift in markets could signal trouble. Integration. The wall gathered all this knowledge, storing it in garrison records, passing it upward through officers, and turning whispers into warnings. It was less a barrier of stone than a network of minds, stretching across thousands of miles, the silent battle of fear perhaps. The greatest genius of the wall was not in stone, not in fire, not in soldiers, but in fear. For the invaders, to stand before it was to see an endless line of stone, stretching beyond sight, whispering that the empire was watching. Even the bravest raiders hesitated, for they knew the wall meant delay, and delay meant defeat. For the defenders, to stand upon it was to feel both burden and pride. Soldiers felt small before its vastness, but also strong, knowing they were part of something greater. For the people, farmers and villagers, sleeping beneath its shadow, felt safe. They knew that even if enemies came, the wall would buy them time, giving hope where once there would have been fear. The wall was not only a barrier of stone, but a barrier of the mind, a nighttime reflection. As we drift into sleep tonight, imagine the wall not only as a monument of labor, but as a mind that thought, a body that moved, and a voice that spoke through fire and smoke. It was the empire's silent companion, standing watch while millions slept. It was a teacher of patience, a master of time. It was the memory of strategy carved into stone. The Great Wall's genius was not that it was unbreakable, but that it made the empire unshakable. As we journey deeper into the tale of the Great Wall, it is easy to imagine it as only a boundary, a rigid line, carved across the mountains and plains of China to keep enemies at bay. But the wall was far more than a fortress of stone. It became a lifeline, a living artery of the empire, channeling trade, ideas, soldiers, supplies, and even cultures across vast distances. It is here, in this block, that we must slow down, let our imagination linger, and understand how the Great Wall was not only a wall of protection, but a road of possibility. To picture this clearly, close your eyes and imagine a long dusty road, cutting across barren lands, hugging the wall like a shadow. On that road move camel caravans, their bells chiming softly in the dry winds, carrying silks and spices, scrolls and secrets. Merchants ride alongside guards, their faces shaded by wide hats, their voices low but filled with purpose. Above them, the wall looms solid, ancient, and eternal. It watches not only battles, but also trade. Not only soldiers, but also poets, travelers, and pilgrims. This is the paradox of the Great Wall. While it was meant to divide, it also connected. Roads of the wall, the hidden arteries. When we think of walls, we think of separation. Yet the Great Wall carried roads on top of it, paths carved by the feet of soldiers who patrolled day and night. Over centuries, these paths became highways of empire. Messages raced across them, carried by mounted riders trained to travel without rest. One rider would gallop across a section of the wall, his horse's hooves pounding like drums, only to pass the message to another rider at the next watchtower. In this way, news traveled hundreds of miles with astonishing speed, but these roads were not for soldiers alone. Traders began to follow them too, hugging the safety of the wall, moving along its shadows to avoid the dangers of open desert. Imagine a caravan loaded with bolts of shimmering silk, lacquerware carved with phoenixes, or paper scrolls filled with philosophy. These caravans moved cautiously, knowing that the wall offered some measure of safety from raiders. Thus, the Great Wall became an unlikely Gita stone companion for those who walked the trade routes. Without it, the deserts would have swallowed them. With it, they had a compass, a landmark that whispered, "You are not alone." This road has been walked before. Guard posts and marketplaces along the wall. Garrisons were stationed in fortified towns. At first, these were purely military outposts, filled with soldiers who sharpened their blades and scanned the horizon for enemy banners. But over time, life softened the edges of these garrisons. Wives joined their husbands, children were born, and markets blossomed at their gates. Merchants soon discovered that these garrison towns were hungry places. Soldiers needed food, wine, clothes, and entertainment. Farmers from the fertile valleys brought grain, beans, and dried meat. Artisans sold boots, saddles, and arrows. Storytellers arrived, too, with drums and songs, spinning tales of distant lands. The military heartbeat of the wall merged with the rhythm of daily life. Close your eyes again and picture one such garrison town. The sun is setting, the wall looms behind, casting a long shadow. In the town square, fires flicker, casting golden light on stalls of roasted chestnuts, candied fruit, and steaming bowls of noodle soup. Soldiers laugh with merchants, children chase one another, and the air smells of spices and roasted meat. Above all of it, the wall stands silent, listening, guarding. The Great Wall was not only a barrier, it was a host. It fed commerce as much as it blocked enemies. The Silk Road connection. To truly understand the lifeline role of the Great Wall, we must speak of the Silk Road, the legendary highway of trade that connected East and West. For centuries, the Silk Road was more than a road. It was an idea, a dream of connection between faraway worlds, and the Great Wall was its spine. Merchants setting out from Shi, the ancient capital, would follow routes that hugged the wall before venturing into the open deserts of Central Asia. To them, the wall was reassurance. The empire was behind them, civilization was near, and safety was never too far away. It was along these roads that silk traveled westward, woven in shimmering colors that dazzled the courts of Persia and Rome. In return, glass, gems, horses, and exotic fruits made their way eastward, enriching the markets of China. Alongside goods came ideas. Buddhism traveled from India, nestling into Chinese monasteries. Persian astronomy and medicine seeped into Chinese scholarship. Stories, myths, and even music passed along the veins of this artery, weaving cultures together. The Great Wall, stern and silent, watched it all. Caravans of the desert. Imagine yourself walking along the edge of the Gobi Desert. The sand stretches endlessly, golden and unforgiving. The wind howls, carrying grains that sting the skin. Yet in the distance, you see Movementa, caravan of camels, swaying like ships on a golden sea. Their backs are heavy with silk, salt, and porcelain. Their hooves press steady rhythms into the earth, while their drivers sing low songs to keep the pace. These caravans did not wander blindly. They followed the wall where they could, for it gave them both safety and guidance. At night, as campfires burned, the wall was a silent guardian, standing against the moonlight like a dark line drawn across the horizon. To these merchants, the wall was more than stone. It was a companion, a friend that stretched on endlessly, as though guiding them forward, whispering, "Beyond me lies fortune. Beyond me lies another world." Cultural crossroads. What happens when so many people, farmers, merchants, monks, travelers pass along the same road for centuries? They leave traces of themselves behind. They plant seeds of culture in places far from home. They mix songs, stories, languages, and beliefs until new blends are born. This happened along the wall, in garrison towns. You could hear Chinese dialects mixing with Central Asian tongues. You could see foreign musicians performing on Chinese instruments, blending scales into melodies never heard before. In one corner, a Buddhist monk from India might chant beneath the shadow of a pagoda, while in another, a Persian trader might recite poetry. The Great Wall bore witness to this mingling of humanity. And though its purpose was to protect China from outsiders, it also allowed those outsiders, cautiously and carefully, to leave their marks upon Chinese culture. The wall as a silent witness as centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, and the wall itself changed shape. Stones crumbled, bricks were replaced, and new sections were built stronger than the old. But always, the wall stood as a witness. It saw battles, yes, but it also saw weddings, festivals, and trade. It heard laughter and crying, the clash of swords and the music of flutes. It smelled blood and incense, smoke from burning villages, and the sweet scent of dumplings cooked for weary travelers. The wall, though mute, became one of the greatest storytellers of China. Each stone, if it could speak, would tell 1,000 tales of human struggle and resilience. A soothing reflection as we rest within this block. Let us think not of war, but of the life that grew alongside the wall. Think of the garrisons where children laughed. Think of the caravans that set out under 1,000,000 stars. Think of the merchants who bartered with soldiers, exchanging grain for silk, wine for stories. The Great Wall of China, though it was built as a shield, became a bridge. It carried not only armies, but also civilizations. It showed that even barriers, when touched by time, can transform into lifelines. So as you drift into calm sleep, let your mind imagine yourself walking along that ancient road. The stones are warm beneath your feet, the night air cool and gentle. Ahead, a watchtower glows faintly with firelight. To your left, a caravan rests, camels kneeling in the sand, their shadows swaying in the moonlight. To your right, a market bustles quietly, with soft music and laughter. And above all of it, the wall stretches endlessly, silent but alive, carrying the pulse of a civilization across the ages. The Great Wall of China, stretching across mountains, deserts, and valleys, is not only a marvel of engineering but also a vast library of stories. Where there are stones and shadows, there are tales. And where there are weary soldiers keeping night watch under a cold moon, there are whispers of spirits, heroes, and mysteries. In this block, let us explore the legends that grew like ivy around the wall. These myths are not mere fancies. They are echoes of people's fears and hopes, of their longing to explain what cannot be explained. To listen to them is to listen to the human soul as it rests uneasy at the edge of civilization, staring into the wilderness beyond the wall. So settle in. Imagine yourself sitting beside a small campfire at the foot of a watchtower. Sparks rise into the night sky, joining the stars. The wind hums against the wall, low and mournful. A soldier clears his throat, leans closer, and begins to tell you a story. The legend of Meng Jiangnu, perhaps the most famous legend tied to the Great Wall, is that of Meng Jiang. It is a story of love, loss, and endless sorrow, told for centuries as a warning, a lament, and a memory of human sacrifice. Long ago, during the Qin dynasty, when Emperor Qin Shi Huang ordered the construction of the first unifying walls, countless men were seized from their homes to labor under the sun. They worked until their hands bled, until their backs broke, until many fell dead from exhaustion. Among these men was the husband of Meng Jiangnu, a woman of great beauty and devotion. On their wedding night, before the candles had even burned out, soldiers arrived to drag her husband away, demanding his labor for the wall. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Meng Jiangnu heard no word from him. At last, when the snow began to fall, she set out on a long journey, carrying warm clothes she had made with her own hands. She walked for days, her feet blistered, her face chapped by icy winds. Finally, she reached the worksite of the Great Wall only to learn that her husband had died from the toil and been buried beneath the stones. Grief consumed her. She wept at the wall, her cries shaking the heavens. Legends say her sorrow was so deep, so pure, that the wall itself collapsed under her tears, revealing the bones of the countless men buried beneath it. Meng Jiangnu's story was passed down for centuries. Some say she became a spirit who still roams the wall at night, weeping in the wind. Others say she is a symbol of love stronger than empires, of human suffering greater than any monument. Even now, as travelers walk along the wall, they say the breeze sometimes carries the faint sound of a woman's crying. Perhaps it is just the wind, or perhaps it is her. The Watchers in the mist. Other tale whispered by soldiers spoke of the Watchers. These were not human guards, but shadowy figures who appeared in the fog. On misty nights, when the wall seemed to float like a dream among the clouds, soldiers would sometimes see figures standing silently upon the parapets, figures dressed in ancient armor, their faces pale, their eyes glowing faintly. They never spoke, they never moved, they only watched, Some believed these were the spirits of fallen soldiers who had died defending the wall, bound forever to continue their duty. Others thought they were omens, warnings of invasions or disasters yet to come. A few even claimed the Watchers were guardians, keeping both the living and the dead safe from harm. To this day, tourists sometimes report strange feelings when walking along the wall at dawn or dusk. The air grows heavy, the silence deep. Some swear they feel eyes upon them, though no one is there. Perhaps the Watchers still remain, keeping their endless vigil. Myths of dragons and serpents. China's history is entwined with dragons, powerful creatures who symbolize luck, wisdom, and strength. Naturally, the Great Wall did not escape their stories. One legend says that when Emperor Qin Shi Huang ordered the wall to be built, his workers struggled in the mountains. The land was treacherous, and they could not decide where to place the foundations. One night, the emperor dreamed of a dragon flying across the land, its body winding over peaks and rivers. When he awoke, he commanded that the wall follow the dragon's path, and so it did. Even today, when seen from the sky, the wall seems to twist and coil like a great stone serpent across the land. Some say this is no coincidence, that the wall is itself a dragon, slumbering beneath the earth, guarding China for all eternity. Others whisper darker tales, that dragons, angered by the disturbance of their mountain lairs, cursed sections of the wall. Workers there fell ill, storms struck, and stones crumbled without reason. These sections, locals say, are haunted by and travelers avoid them after sunset. Lanterns of the dead soldiers along the wall often face death not only in battle, but also from hunger, disease, or sheer loneliness. To honor their fallen comrades, they would sometimes light small lanterns and set them upon the wall's edge, letting the wind carry the flames into the night. But legends tell of nights when lanterns appeared on their own. Soldiers would wake to see dozens of glowing lights floating along the wall, moving slowly like a procession of souls. Some swore they heard whispers, others the faint clinking of armor. The old believed these were the spirits of soldiers returning to patrol, unwilling to abandon their posts. The lanterns, they said, were their way of reminding the living that duty never ends, not even after death. Even in recent times, a few travelers have claimed to see faint orbs of light flickering in the distance along the wall. The locals shrugged and say, the soldiers are still walking, songs in the wind. Many soldiers brought flutes, drums, or simple stringed instruments to the garrisons to ease the long nights of waiting. They played songs of home, of longing, of lost loves. Over time, people began to say that the wall itself remembered these songs. On stormy nights, when the wind raced through the cracks in the stones, strange melodies could be heard. Sometimes it was a low hum, like the deep beat of a drum. Other times, it was a high, clear whistle, like a flute. Locals would pause and say, listen, the wall is singing. To them, the music was not frightening, but comforting. It was the voice of those who had once lived and died along the wall, keeping company with the living still. The Woman in White. No collection of wall legends is complete without mention of the Woman in White. Her story varies, but always she appears the same. A pale woman in flowing robes, her face hidden, standing silently atop the wall at night. Some say she is the ghost of a noblewoman whose lover died in battle, doomed to wander in search of him. Others claim she is Meng Jiangnu herself, appearing not as a peasant but as a celestial spirit. Soldiers feared her, for those who saw her were said to die within the year. Yet others thought she was a protector, appearing to warn the garrisons of danger. Even today, there are tourists who whisper of seeing a white figure in photographs taken along the wall, though no one had stood there. A trick of light, a wandering fog, or the Woman in White, still walking. A gentle reflection. As these stories float around us, we should not see them only as tales of fear. They are songs of memory, fragments of the people who lived and labored along the wall. Every civilization builds walls not only of stone but also of stories. These stories are how people make sense of suffering, of death, of duty. They are how the living speak to the dead, and how the past whispers to the future. So as you close your eyes tonight, let your mind drift along the wall once more. Imagine the stars above, glittering like silver lanterns. Imagine the sound of a flute carried by the wind. Imagine a woman weeping, her tears falling like rain. Imagine dragons twisting in the mountains, their scales shimmering in moonlight. The Great Wall is not only stone, it is memory. It is dream. It is the quiet breath of centuries. And if you listen closely, very closely, you might hear its stories still. When most of us picture the Great Wall, we imagine the sweeping towers, the soldiers with spears, the endless march of stone over mountain ridges. But history, like life, is not only made of battles and rulers. It is made of small moments of meals cooked, of children's laughter, of weary feet warming by fires. The wall was not just a military line. It was a living world. Watchtowers were not just sentry posts, they were homes. Garrisons were not just barracks, they were communities. And between the vastness of stone and sky, thousands of ordinary people lived their days in ways both familiar and strange to us. Tonight, let us walk quietly into their lives. Morning in the garrison, the day often began before the sun. As the horizon paled with the first light, the trumpet of a horn, or the beat of a drum called soldiers awake, they rose from their mats in the watchtowers, rubbing sleep from their eyes, pulling on rough wool or padded cotton tunics against the cold. Breakfast was simple steamed millet, flat cakes of wheat, sometimes a little pickled vegetable. Tea, when available, was weak but warming. The soldiers ate quickly, knowing the long hours ahead. Some were sent to patrol the wall, walking the length of stone between towers, scanning the horizon for movement. Others tended to repairs, replacing loose bricks, clearing snow, or reinforcing wooden gates. A few cared for horses, brushing down their coats, ensuring saddles and tack were ready. For many, the mornings were quiet, endless stretches of walking, eyes on the horizon, hearts waiting for a danger that might never come. The routine of soldiers, the men stationed along the wall, came from many walks of life. Some were peasants pressed into service. Some were professional soldiers, hardened by years of campaigns. Some were criminals sentenced to guard duty in lieu of punishment. But once stationed, they all shared the same rhythm. Days were divided into watches: morning, midday, evening, and midnight. Each watch meant pacing the walls, keeping the fires lit, sounding horns at the sight of riders. To break the monotony, they trained. Archery practice was common, rows of men loosing arrows into straw targets, the air filled with the twang of bowstrings. Sword drills, too, kept their muscles sharp, and when time allowed, they played games of dice or sang songs of home, voices echoing against the stones. Some soldiers scratched carvings into the wall itself, names, dates, even crude drawings. These marks remain in some places today, reminders that behind every brick was a man with a story. Food and sustenance. Feeding the wall was as great a challenge as building it. Grain, vegetables, and salted meats were transported from nearby villages or military farms. Where land permitted, small plots were cultivated near the garrisons. Soldiers grew beans, cabbages, onions, anything hardy enough to withstand the harsh climate. Meals were plain but sustaining. Millet porridge was a staple, sometimes flavored with wild herbs. Dumplings, when meat was available, offered rare comfort. On festivals, families and soldiers alike shared steamed buns or noodles stretched thin by skilled hands. Water was carried from rivers or melted snow. In dry regions, wells were dug, though water was precious. Tea leaves, when available, lifted spirits on cold mornings. Rice wine, saved for celebrations, brought laughter to weary nights. Food was never just sustenance, was a taste of home. A single dumpling, a sip of warm tea, could remind a soldier of his mother's kitchen, of a family waiting far away. Families by the wall. Though the wall was built for war, life insisted on planting roots even in its shadow. Some soldiers' families lived nearby, wives, children, aging parents. They built small homes at the base of the wall or in nearby villages. Living alongside the garrisons, children grew up under the watch of the wall. They chased one another along dirt paths, their laughter carrying up to the towers. They played games with sticks and pebbles, mimicking the drills of the soldiers they saw every day. To them, the wall was not just a fortress, it was the edge of their world, a backdrop to childhood. Women worked hard, tending gardens, weaving cloth, carrying water. They baked flatbreads in clay ovens, patched torn uniforms, and offered prayers for safety when horns sounded from the towers. Some even brought food to the sentries, climbing narrow stairs with baskets of hot dumplings. In this way, the wall was not only stone and soldiers, it was families, woven into its life like threads in a great tapestry. Festivals and small joys. In hardship, festivals were celebrated. On the Lunar New Year, red paper charms were pasted upon wooden doors. Lanterns glowed like stars along the wall, carrying prayers into the night. Firecrackers, when available, crackled and popped, scaring away not only evil spirits but also the gnawing loneliness of winter. Mid-autumn, brought mooncakes, dense pastries filled with sweet paste, shared under the full moon. Families and soldiers alike gazed upward, believing that loved ones far away looked at the same silver disc. Music was another joy. A soldier might play a bamboo flute, its clear notes drifting into the valley. Another strummed a lute, while others clapped along. Songs of love, songs of longing, songs of bravery, they filled the air, softening the harshness of stone. Even laughter was a kind of rebellion. Around small fires, men told jokes, shared stories of home, or teased one another about clumsy swordplay. For a few moments, they were not soldiers of an empire, they were simply men, human and alive. Nights along the wall, night brought both beauty and fear. Stars blazed overhead, the Milky Way stretching like a river of light. The silence was vast, broken only by the crackle of fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. But night was also when danger crept. Raiding parties might strike under cover of darkness. Wolves prowled the forests. The wind itself seemed alive, moaning through the cracks of the wall. Sentries walked their posts with torches in hand, the flames flickering against stone. Fire beacons, piled high with wood and straw, stood ready. If one beacon was lit, it could be seen for miles, passing the signal along the wall like a chain of fire. For families, nights were quieter. Children curled against their mothers. Stories were told in whispers of dragons, of heroes, of distant lands. In the hush before sleep, the wall loomed as both protector and mystery. Dreams of the soldiers in their hearts. Soldiers dreamed. Some dreamed of home, of rice fields shining with water, of parents smiling at the gate. Some dreamed of glory, of promotions, of their names carved into history. Others dreamed simply of rest, of a day without patrols, without fear, without war. But dreams were fragile along the wall. Letters home were rare, visits rarer still. For many years passed with only the memory of faces long unseen, and yet they endured. Perhaps it was duty, perhaps it was pride, or perhaps it was the simple truth that life, no matter where planted, finds a way to grow. A gentle reflection. As we close our eyes to this part of the story, let us remember that the wall was not just the work of emperors or armies, it was the work of ordinary lives of men and women who rose each morning, tended fires, shared meals, raised children, and looked to the stars with hope. Their lives may seem distant, but in truth, they are not so different from ours. We, too, wake with the sun. We, too, laugh at festivals, share meals with family, and whisper stories at night. The wall may be stone, but the heartbeat within it is human. So as you drift to sleep, imagine yourself not as an emperor, not as a soldier, but as one of those quiet souls who lived by the wall. Hear the crackle of the fire, taste the warmth of dumplings, feel the small hand of a child clutching yours as lanterns glow in the night. The Great Wall, for all its grandeur, was built upon such moments, and perhaps that is why it still stands not only as a monument of stone, but as a memory of human life, enduring and eternal.